Settle in. Let your mind drift back through the centuries. Forget the hum of modern life, the glow of your phone, the buzz of traffic outside. You're safe, you're warm, and tonight we're going to gently drift off together, though our destination might be a little saltier than expected. Imagine yourself on a vast wooden ship, creaking and groaning as it sways across the Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1583, the age of Spanish conquest. An empire rides on the waves, chasing gold across continents. But this story isn't about kings or conquistadors. This is about the men beneath the deck, the forgotten ones, the ones who rode, slept, coughed, and died between crates of silver. This isn't a tale of heroes. It's a slow-burning account of hardship, of rough cloth, stale biscuits, and the smell of human sweat sealed beneath wood. You'll hear of storms and superstition, mysterious maps and half-truths whispered in candlelight. But above all, you'll see how quickly even the most romantic notions of sea adventure unravel when faced with the cold, wet reality of life aboard a Spanish galleon. So close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing match the slow rhythm of the waves. And imagine just for a moment that you've been conscripted. No one asked you. No one cared what you wanted. But now you're here, shoulder to shoulder with the forgotten crew. And your job is to row. Chapter 1. Rowing in ships below deck with rats in salt down here. It never quite smells clean. The air is a soupy mix of wet wood, sweat-soaked linen, and the occasional burst of boiled salt pork. If you're lucky. There's no sunlight, just lanterns hung low, their flames flickering behind smoky glass. Shadows lurch across the beams as the ship rocks beneath you. The boards creak like old joints, and the hull groans as if trying to remind you this whole place is just a box of nails floating in deep black water. You're below deck, far from the noble captains and polished brass of naval paintings. This is the belly of the beast, the ore deck, and your shift begins now. You take your place on the bench, still warm from the man before you. You left behind a stain and the vague smell of vinegar and exhaustion. There's a rhythm to the rowing pull, pull, breathe. No one talks much. Your hands wrap around the oar, and the blisters from last week start bleeding again before the first hour is through. You pull anyway, because the alternative is a flogging, or worse, being labeled dead weight. You've barely eaten. The last meal was a brick-hard biscuit with worms crawling inside. No one even pretends to pick them out anymore. The ship's cook calls them sea raisins. You pretend it's funny, but really, it just saves you the trouble of chewing. You're allowed a cup of water that tastes faintly of mold. If it's wine, it's the kind that's turned sour and sharp on the tongue. Around you, bodies shift like damp sacks of grain. Men cough, groan, scratch at lice, and lean against the damp wood when their strength falters. One man nearby mutters a prayer every time the oar dips into the water. Another has stopped rowing altogether. He might be asleep. He might be dead. It's hard to tell in the dark. At the edge of your vision, something scurries. It might be a rat. It might be three. You've learned not to chase them off. They're braver than the men down here. Some of them nibble through the biscuit barrels. Others sleep under your hammock, eating whatever you drop. A few have learned to nibble the calluses off your feet while you dream. You try not to move too much when it happens. They bite when startled, and the hammock, if you can call it that. You sleep in 6-hour rotations. When your rowing shift ends, you crawl into a sticky sheet of canvas suspended by ropes, swaying with the ship. You never truly dry. Your clothes cling to your body, soaked in sweat and salt, and the ceiling drips with condensation that forms from the collective breath of 80 men packed into a wooden shoebox. Every few hours, the hatch above creaks open, and someone dumps down a bucket of vinegar water. It sloshes across the floorboards and pools beneath the benches. Supposedly it's to clean the deck. Really, it just gives the rats something new to swim in. Now and then, a voice yells down from above. A command. A change in course. A warning of oncoming wind. You wonder if it's good news or bad, but mostly you just keep rowing. There's no view, no breeze, no stars, just the endless rhythm of the oar. You're not heading toward adventure. You're just trying to reach the next shift without passing out. Some nights, Someone screams in their sleep. They cry out about sinking ships, burning masts, voices whispering beneath the waves. No one wakes them. Because most of you have had the same dreams, or worse, you wonder what it's like above deck. To feel the wind, to see the sun. The captain eats fresh bread and talks about God and empire. The officers wear silk sashes and polished boots, and you've started to forget what grass feels like beneath your feet, or what it means to walk more than 6 feet in any direction without hitting a wall. And yet, despite the stench, the sores, the hunger, and the sweat, you keep rowing. Because even in the dark, even half-starved, you know the gold must be real. It has to be. Otherwise, none of this would make sense. Or maybe none of it ever did. There's a rhythm to misery that only long voyages seem to reveal. It doesn't arrive in waves. It creeps in slowly, day by day, until you begin to forget where the pain ends and the routine begins. And on this galleon, the routine is everything. You row. You sleep. You eat something that may or may not be edible. Then you row again. Time loses its shape. Hours blur. Days are marked not by sunrise or sunset, which you can't even see, but by the steady deterioration of everything around you, your strength, your clothes, your will to care about anything that doesn't involve fresh air or dry socks. Let's talk about those socks for a moment. If you even have a pair, they're made of coarse wool and have fused to your skin in strange places. Your feet have developed little ecosystems of their own, damp, tender, and constantly itchy. The only thing worse than keeping your boots on all day is taking them off and facing whatever horror lurks inside. And yet, there are some men who still manage to sing. Not well, not loudly. But during the night shifts, you'll sometimes hear a low hum rising over the creaking beams. A sea ballad. A mother's lullaby. A prayer disguised as a tune. Most men stay silent, but that hum reminds you that someone somewhere still remembers what home sounds like. Then there are the shifts when someone snaps. Maybe it's the heat. Maybe it's the lice. Maybe it's just the constant stink of boiled fat from the kitchen deck. But one man suddenly stands mid-row, screaming that he sees flames or angels or a woman with golden hair. The others duck, expecting fists or worse. The bosun climbs down. There's a struggle. Sometimes the man is gagged. Sometimes he's tied down. If it happens more than once, he disappears. No one explains. No one asks. You just notice the extra ration of biscuit the next day, and a space where someone used to sit. There's a word the officers like to use for the crew. They call them saltmen. It sounds romantic, like the title of a sea folk song. But down here, it just means disposable. Salt preserves meat. But salt also eats through skin, softens nails, and burns when it seeps into open cuts. You're surrounded by salt, in the air, in your sweat, in the food, in the water barrels that taste like brine and mildew. Your lips crack, your teeth ache. And still there's gold somewhere out there. They say meals come at odd hours. Not because there's any set time, but because the ship's cook only has one eye and no real schedule. He boils everything in a single pot and scoops it into bowls made from broken shells or gourd halves. You get what you get. One day it's beans. Another day it's mystery meat that probably once had legs. It all tastes like firewood and grease. Someone jokes it's rat stew, you laugh. But deep down, you're not entirely sure they're wrong. Above deck, they say, the air smells different, cleaner, colder. You've been up there maybe twice. Once during loading, once during a squall, when all hands were ordered above to help secure the sails. For one brief moment, you saw the horizon. Gray, endless, and cold. It almost felt like freedom. Then the bosun screamed your name, and you were back down here, arms burning from holding ropes you didn't understand. Your hands aren't hands anymore. They're tools. Calloused, cracked, permanently curled around the memory of the oar. When you sleep, if you sleep, you dream you're still rowing. One man once said he dreamed of land. A field of wheat, swaying in the sun. He cried when he woke up. That was the last time he ever spoke. Sometimes you wonder how many of these men ever volunteered. Rumor has it half were debtors press-ganged in a Spanish port after drinking too much. Others were prisoners offered freedom if they survived the voyage. A few might be here willingly, but that thought doesn't bring much comfort. Willingly rowing toward months of salt rot and festering wounds, that's a kind of madness you're not ready to understand. And there are rats. Still the rats. They're smarter than they should be. They've learned where the dried fruit is stored. They vanish when officers come down, then return in groups. You've seen them fight over a biscuit. You've also seen them nibble on a man's toe while he slept through a fever. Someone joked that the rats would outlive them all. You weren't sure if it was a joke. On better days, the ship creaks less. You learn to time your rowing with the waves, which saves your back a little strain. Someone shares a story from a town you've never heard of. For a brief second, the stench fades, the darkness softens, and you forget where you are. Then a wave hits hard, a lantern crashes down, and a scream from the deck above reminds you that storms are always waiting. Still, you row. Still, you eat. Still, you survive barely, and you wonder, as you pull the oar for the 1,000th time, if anyone on land has ever thought about the men below the deck. The ones who never see the gold. The ones who never see their families again. The ones who keep the empire afloat, but who die in silence. And just when you begin to believe there's no end to this, a voice from above calls for a crew change. Your shift is over, you rise, joints popping, back aching. You stumble toward the hammocks, past another man coughing blood into his hands. You lay down. The chemist cradles you like a coffin. You close your eyes, knowing you have 6 hours to rest. If the rats leave you be, you dream of nothing. Because sometimes nothing is the kindest thing your mind can give you. Chapter 2. The last voyage of the San Esteban segment 1. It began like so many voyages of its kind. With brass polished to a mirror shine, sails bleached white under the Spanish sun, and a cargo hold stuffed with silver bars stacked like loaves of bread. The San Esteban was never meant to be famous. It was just one of dozens of treasure galleons bound for the ports of New Spain. But history has a way of clinging to the wrecked more than the successful. And the San Esteban, for all its splendor, would never return to Spain. 4 ships, each heavy with treasure, bound for Havana, where they joined the larger fleet for safe passage across the Atlantic. Sailors played dice on deck and carved crude symbols into the masts for luck. The next, it was a cathedral of crashing walls. Silver bars slid across the lower decks like battering rams. Below, the ballast shifted dangerously. One unlucky sailor was pinned between a crate of pistols and the hull. Others simply vanished, swept overboard in the blackness. Sails ripped like paper. Cannons rolled free, smashing legs and splintering ribs. Water poured in from the hatches above. The San Esteban was not a nimble ship. She wallowed, her rudder bucked, and her crew fought to keep her upright even as waves taller than houses slammed against her hull. The San Esteban lay on her side, half buried in surf. Her treasure, her reason for existing, was still trapped inside her hold, twisted and unreachable. Survivors limped ashore, sunburned, barefoot, broken, and the local tribes, already wary of foreign invaders, saw little reason to help men who carried guns and war crosses. Within days, the survivors began to vanish. Some died from their wounds. Others wandered into the wilderness, seeking salvation. A few tried to build a raft. None succeeded. And then came the second silence. The storm was still raging. Visibility was low. They were somewhere near the shores of what is now Texas, but to the men on board, it could have been the edge of the world. Even today, pieces of her lie hidden off the Texas coast, glimpsed only when the tides are low and the sand shifts just right. Locals sometimes find fragments, nails, beads, silver buttons. And they say if you walk the shore at night, you can still hear the cries of the final crew, begging for a rescue that never came. There were prayers each morning, shouted to the Virgin and the saints, and laughter each evening when the wine hadn't yet turned sour. They found evidence of something stranger. Ritual objects buried in the sand. Footprints that didn't match any known pattern of escape. And, most curiously, silver coins carved with symbols that didn't belong to any Catholic nation. But the deeper into the Gulf they sailed, the heavier the sky became. Had the crew found something they shouldn't have? Had they traded with people the church didn't approve of? Or had the land itself claimed its price in gold? The horizon darkened. Birds stopped following. And in the distance, the wind carried a sound no sailor likes to hear silence. It was a plan as old as the route itself, safety in numbers. But the sea, of course, had other ideas. The masts groaned, and the main deck buckled under the weight of centuries of imperial ambition. Some men leapt into the waves. Others held tight, praying for a miracle. But the sea did not care. It swallowed them one by one, then spat their broken ship against the rocks. Imagine yourself standing on her deck as she first pulls away from the docks in Veracruz. The San Esteban had lost sight of her sister ships. Her sails were ruined. Her compass had been crushed under falling rigging. They were alone, drifting in a sea that no longer wanted them. The crew is shouting, ropes are tightening, gulls circle overhead, and below, buried deep in the belly of the ship, sits her fortune. Crates were jammed wherever they'd fit. Horses were tethered beside bales of tobacco. Religious icons rattled in wooden boxes, destined for churches back in Castile. Every object, no matter how divine or ordinary, rode the same waves. And in the quarters above, her crew tried to ignore the way the ship groaned. She was aging, heavier than she'd ever been. Some men whispered she was too slow, too weighed down to outrun storms or pirates. But the money was good. And besides, there were always rumors like that. The year is 1554. Spain's empire is booming, fed by the silver veins of the Americas. Every galleon that sails homeward carries the wealth of entire civilizations in its belly coins. Jewels, goblets, and ingots, all claimed by the crown. The king takes his fifth. The rest is divided among merchants, captains, and those who managed to survive long enough to see Spanish shores again. The San Esteban was loaded carefully, though not lovingly. As the galleon departed, she joined three others, her sister ships, Espiritu Santo, Santa Maria de Chiar, and San Andres. The voyage began well enough. The sun was strong. The winds were steady. The storm hit without mercy. One moment, the sea was calm. Men screamed. Horses broke free and trampled anything in their path. Barrels snapped open. At some point during the second day, the captain realized they would not reach Havana, and then came the coast. They could smell it before they saw it, the scent of pine. The dry heat of sand carried on the wind, but landfall offered no safety. The San Esteban hit the reef first. The impact was sickening. The hull cracked like a roasted chestnut. Water poured in. By morning, the wreckage was scattered across the sand like bones. No one came to rescue them. They were hundreds of miles from any Spanish outpost. The land was unfamiliar, hostile. But here's the twist. Decades later, when Spanish officials returned to salvage the wreck, they found more than treasure. Rumors began to spread. The San Esteban was never recovered in full. Storms buried her remains under dunes and coral. Days passed, then weeks. The few survivors of the San Esteban faded into the wilderness, swallowed by the dry wind and the indifferent trees of the coastal scrub. Some may have tried to follow the stars back toward known settlements. Others, likely injured or delirious, simply sat down among the dunes and waited for death. They found the wreck, but what they took were tools, cloth, and bits of usable iron. They avoided the chests of silver. Some say they believed the treasure was cursed. Others simply had no use for it, but they did speak of the wreck. Their oral history tells of a ship that screamed in the night and bled black water, of pale men who emerged from the surf and fell to their knees. It was a story, a Spanish galleon that had vanished without a final log entry, whose men had died without last words, whose gold had never been fully accounted for. Bone fragments showing signs of healing that suggested a long, slow starvation. A few may have tried to integrate with local tribes. Her purpose delivering silver to the empire replaced by something more ghost-like and impossible to trace. The ship herself had cracked open like an egg, releasing everything she carried into a land that neither asked for it nor understood its value. Just a stretch of beach where the dunes move like waves, slowly burying and revealing an endless rotation. Children play there now, building castles in the sand, unaware that only feet below lies a wrecked empire, rusting silently in the dark. There are faint records, barely legible, of Spanish-speaking castaways later found hundreds of miles inland, a glint of something metal poking from the surf. A shape under the water that looks like ribs? Once, a child uncovered what looked like a coin, but it turned out to be a flattened washer from a modern boat engine. Still, the legend persists. The gold, they say, is still down there, but so is the curse. Living in animal hide shelters and wearing necklaces made of seashells and gold buttons. Others may have been hidden by the survivors, buried beneath trees that no longer stand. And a few, perhaps, are still held tightly in the hands of skeletons, clutched in death with the same desperation they once clutched hope. Not every legend ends in glory. Some end in the sand, beneath the feet of beachgoers, with only the occasional storm to whisper the truth. And a wooden crucifix charred along one edge as if someone had tried to burn it in desperation before extinguishing the fire halfway. A journey that didn't just fail, it dissolved. A ship that didn't sink in one piece, but shattered into 1,000 stories, none of them fully told. And yet, there was no grand treasure to recover. The majority of the silver had likely been scattered, washed out, or quietly taken long ago by those who had no reason to leave a record. Of silver that burned the skin if handled too long. The water is shallow, but treacherous. Divers work in silence, brushing centuries of silt from objects that haven't seen sunlight since the reign of Elizabeth I. Every artifact tells a quiet story. A pewter spoon, a leather shoe, a fragment of wool too rotten to lift. Not riches, but reminders of lives lived in fear and sweat. Of ambition dashed against coral. Of a voyage built on gold, ended in salt. The Spanish crown never issued a large-scale search. A few reports were filed. A name was written on parchment. Then the empire moved on, its attention shifting to newer ships, fresher silver, and different wars. What the San Esteban left behind remained undisturbed for centuries, wooden ribs buried beneath shifting sandbars. Iron nails rusted into lace, coins wedged between coral and rock. Time, tide, and silence did the rest. The ship's fate became more myth than record, a footnote in dusty ledgers in Madrid, misfiled and forgotten. But on the coast itself, the memory lingered in strange ways. The local Karankawa tribes had no interest in Spanish wealth. Archaeologists would later dismiss such tales, but in time they would be forced to reconsider. In the early 1970s, a shift in sand uncovered something unusual. A curved timber. Heavy and salt-stained, buried under a dune near the waterline. At first, it seemed like nothing more than driftwood. But a local diver, intrigued by old legends and irregular wave patterns, decided to investigate. It wasn't long before coins began to emerge, their surfaces worn but still bearing the unmistakable stamp of Philip II. A handful of cannonballs. A rosary blackened by salt. A shard of green glass from a wine bottle, still sharp enough to cut skin. And further inland, half buried in a ridge of shell and seaweed, a single human tooth filed flat, as was sometimes done among enslaved Africans brought aboard as forced labor. What he found would reignite interest in the vanished galleons. Just beneath the sand lay the shattered remains of a hull copper fastenings, ballast stones and fragments of what had once been finely carved Spanish crates. The team knew immediately what they had found. It wasn't just a ship. Instead, what remained was stranger. Carvings on wood that didn't match known Spanish styles. Some researchers speculated that the survivors of the wreck had split into factions, some trying to reach help, others turning on one another. The San Esteban, it seems, didn't just disappear. It unraveled, her people scattered, her wealth diluted. Today, what's left is part of a slow, patient excavation effort, constantly challenged by the Gulf's tides, hurricanes, and shifting sands. There's no marker on the shore, no monument or museum nearby. Sometimes, at low tide, visitors claim to see odd things. For every piece recovered, there are 100 more never found. Some may lie further inland, carried by storms and time. What makes the San Esteban so haunting is the wreck or the treasure or even the lives lost. It's a sense of unfinished business, and so we remember her here, gently, quietly. A ship launched with ceremony, lost with confusion, and remembered by accident. Chapter 3: Maps, Myths, and the Fountain of Youth. There's something deeply human about trying to make sense of the unknown. In the 16th century, this instinct led to the creation of maps that were part instruction manual, part spiritual talisman, and part elaborate guesswork. Picture yourself holding one now, parchment faded at the edges, covered with hand-drawn coastlines that squirm like river eels. It's not precise, but it's not meant to be. Instead, it's a promise, a reassurance that someone somewhere has seen the edge of the world and returned to sketch it. These maps weren't just tools. They were filled with monsters, warnings, and marvels. There are dragons lounging near the corners, breathing decorative smoke. Sea serpents curling around islands little boats are drawn mid-sinking, captioned with Latin warnings like "Here be demons." Cartographers included saints and sun gods, even tiny painted mermaids. It wasn't just for flair. It was an attempt to prepare men for everything they might encounter, real or imagined. And for the men aboard a Spanish galleon, imagination was essential. It filled the gaps between what they feared and what they could explain. The ocean was vast, and charts were imperfect. So they relied on more than compass and star. They relied on stories. Every crew carried them, tucked into their minds like folded paper charms. Some believed in floating islands that appeared only at dawn. Others swore by tales of golden cities just inland, hidden behind curtains of mist and guarded by birds that spoke human tongues. But no tale carried more weight than the Fountain of Youth. According to the legend, somewhere across the sea, beyond jagged reefs and poisoned mangroves, there was a spring that could undo time. One sip and you would be made whole again. Gray hair would darken, wounds would close, worn backs would straighten. For men living in constant pain, rowing through fever dreams, this wasn't just folklore, it was hope. Quiet, distant, unreachable hope. They said it had been found once already. Juan Ponce de Leon, the former governor of Puerto Rico, had supposedly stumbled upon its waters in the swamps of Florida. Or was it in the jungles of Honduras? Or perhaps an island no longer visible? No one quite agreed, but that was part of the power. If it existed everywhere, then it had to exist somewhere. The Crown didn't endorse the legend, at least not publicly. But they never fully denied it either. After all, a belief that kept men volunteering for brutal voyages wasn't worth correcting. And so the myth grew. With every shipwreck, it became easier to say that the sailors hadn't perished, only discovered a better life. With every crew that vanished inland, whispers followed that they had found the spring, dropped their armor, and started over. Maps began to reflect this. A faint blue line here, a delicate dot there. Fuente de la Juventud, always near a river. Always just a little farther than the last known landmark. Captains would sometimes chart a course near it for morale. Not as a mission, just a possibility. A soft lie to keep men rowing. And it wasn't just youth. Other legends floated between the decks. Tales of cities paved with gold El Dorado. Of course, the great shining promise buried in South America's hills. There were whispers of forests made of crystal. A valley in Patagonia filled with giants. An island of women warriors who sharpened their blades on stone altars and feared no man. These stories were told softly, usually after nightfall. When the oars were stowed and the hammocks swung gently and the men stared up at ceilings they dememorized. In those moments, myths were a form of medicine. They soothed, distracted, and numbed. It wasn't delusion. It was survival. When the sea had taken your friends, when you hadn't tasted fruit in 6 months, when your gums bled and your fingers refused to grip the oar without shaking, you clung to stories, not because you believed them, but because they gave shape to the suffering. They made it mean something. And not every map misled. Some were careful, practical, obsessed with wind patterns and reef locations. But even the best of them relied on secondhand information. Most captains never knew for sure whether they were following truth or error. One misplaced decimal in a ship log, one misdrawn bay, and a galleon could veer weeks off course. There's a record of one captain who chased a coastline for 6 days, convinced it was the western tip of Cuba. It turned out to be a mirage formed by a curve in the wind and a trick of the clouds. He broke down weeping when the land vanished overnight. Not from embarrassment, from exhaustion. Because hope, once lost, leaves a sharper ache than pain ever could. And then there were the stars. For all the maps, the true guide was always above. Star navigation was sacred. Sailors memorized patterns, linked them to verses and chants. But even stars could lie. Storms hid them. Fog blurred them. And sometimes, especially after weeks at sea, the mind began to reshape what the eye saw. A constellation might seem to move. A comet might be mistaken for a flare from another ship. Or a sign from God. Some even believed shooting stars were souls of the drowned, lighting the way home. Among sailors, the boundary between faith and superstition was thin. A St. Christopher medallion could hang next to a rabbit's foot. Holy water might be sprinkled beside a charm carved from bone. Men made offerings to both the Virgin and the wind. They prayed. They spat to ward off spirits. They drew circles in ash around their bunks, not out of ignorance, but out of habit. The sea demanded ritual. It made no promises, and it answered no prayers. But ritual gave shape to fear, and in the quiet hours when the water slapped gently against the hull and no voice dared rise above a whisper, belief was all they had. Not all who followed these myths were common sailors with tired hands and blistered feet. Some were captains. Some were noblemen. A few were even educated enough to read Latin maps and parse nautical records, yet still found themselves pulled by the quiet gravity of belief. He had heard rumors of a river inlet along the southern Florida coast where native tribes washed wounds in a mineral spring that glowed under moonlight. He left the main fleet, telling his men it was a short detour, just one day's sail. He was never seen again, a valley that aged you in reverse as you walked downhill. They had no time for dreams. They measured wind, current, and temperature. They relied on math, not miracles. But even among them, the stories persisted told not as facts, but as something softer, older. A comfort on nights when compasses spun strangely and the stars blinked like dying lanterns. To do so would be to confess that all their pain and sacrifice had been for nothing. So they altered the story. They claimed the spring only worked under a full moon, or only for those pure of heart. But to live for months at sea with nothing but hardtack and salted meat, to row in darkness while your skin cracks and your gums swell, to watch your friends die of fever or vanish into the surf against that backdrop. A story about eternal youth or a golden city isn't childish. It's merciful, or only if you drank from a particular carved cup lost years ago in a fire. One sailor, whose diary was recovered from the remains of a beached vessel, wrote a single sentence over and over again on the last page. They remain in our maps too, though less obvious now. A curve here, a dotted line there. A reminder that even in an age of satellites and GPS, we still sometimes leave space for the unknown. The water is coming, the water is coming, the water is coming. Was it a fever dream? A last hope? Or had he seen something the rest had missed? We'll never know. But the sentence remained, scrawled in shaking hand, stained with salt. That way, the legend lived on. Untested, unreachable, but never quite disproven. One map in particular, dated 1593 and recovered from the wreckage of a Portuguese merchant ship, shows a series of islands labeled only with question marks and a hand-drawn sun with a face. It only trades them for time. And for every legend that fades, another waits beneath the waves, drawn not in ink, but in memory. The promise of a miracle spring or golden city could keep a mutinous crew from turning back. Often, they found only silence. A spring, yes, but the water was stale. The trees looked like any other trees. There were no songs, no healing, no golden glow. Just the sound of wind in the leaves and the quiet disappointment of unmet dreams. Some captains used this deliberately. One recorded in his logbook that he showed his crew a fake map, hastily drawn the night before. He claimed it had come from a dying native who had seen the fountain with his own eyes. Even now, we tell ourselves things to make the days go by. We believe in lucky socks, in rituals before exams, in small comforts that don't hold up under scrutiny but still feel necessary. The sailors of the 16th century were no different. When faced with hunger, rot, and endless gray sea, they clung to story not because they were gullible, but because they were human. The crew rallied. They worked through storms. They rode with blistered palms. Only later did they learn the map was a lie. By then, they were too far to turn back, and the captain had already met his end struck down in a skirmish at an inland village that had no interest in legends. Its eyes are closed. Its mouth is open. Some have interpreted this as a poetic metaphor. Others believe it was a warning. And every so often, one of them acted on it. Broken armor, rotted boots, and a silver cross driven into the ground beside a stagnant pool. The area was later marked on some maps with an X not for treasure, but as a caution. Not because they found the fountain, but because they found nothing at all. And the fear of nothing, especially in the New World, was often worse than any monster drawn on parchment. Not just as a story told to pass the time, but as a course of action, a mission, and almost always it ended poorly. There's a case from 1565 where a Spanish commander named Mateo de Barrientos, given charge of a small escort vessel, steered his ship off its scheduled route while traveling from Cuba to Cartagena. What's more unsettling is that years later, a different captain reported finding remnants of a camp along that same coast. As the empire expanded and expeditions pushed farther inland, the myths adapted. The location of the Fountain of Youth was never fixed. If it wasn't in Florida, then perhaps it was in Guyana, where rivers ran like silver and parrots spoke with human voices. If not there, then perhaps in the jungles of Yucatan or along the high Andean plateaus. One document claimed it could only be found if you were already dying, which conveniently explained why no one ever returned to confirm its existence. Cartographers struggled to keep up. Some maps became bloated with impossible features. A mountain shaped like a throne. A volcano that spat out gold dust. Of course, the more pragmatic navigators dismissed it all. And belief had power. When men believed they were close to salvation, they endured longer, rode harder, took risks. And what about the men who actually made it to these so-called magical places? Yet even then, many refused to admit the truth. There's something deeply tragic about it, but also something familiar. Some modern historians mock these myths as primitive, childish, or foolish, and in rare cases, belief turned to poetry. Today, the legacy of these myths lives on in place names, valleys, islands, all named after legends. The sea, after all, never truly gives up its secrets. Chapter 4, Banquets in Gold in a Seville Merchant. Villa, while salt clung to the skin of sailors and rot crept through the seams of wooden galleons, far away from the open sea, behind heavy doors carved from walnut and iron, life was remarkably quiet. The kind of quiet padded by fine rugs, softened by music drifting from inner courtyards, and uninterrupted by anything resembling hardship. In Seville, the wealth of the empire came to rest. It entered through docks thick with ropes and sweating porters, passed through guarded storehouses, and then very carefully into the counting rooms of Spain's merchant elite. It's late afternoon in the merchant quarter. The sun hangs heavy above the orange-tiled roofs, casting long shadows across the marble walkways of Casa de Morales, one of many stately homes belonging to men who never touched the oars but owned everything they carried. You're standing in the atrium now. Light filters down through an open oculus above, illuminating a mosaic floor of black and ochre stone. At the center is a small fountain shaped like a lion, its mouth forever dribbling spring water into a cool basin. The air smells faintly of jasmine and cooked butter. From the kitchen, servants pass silently, balancing trays of roasted almond cakes, stewed figs, and pitchers of dark wine. Beyond the arched passageways, the dining hall waits. Inside, the merchant himself reclines slightly in a carved high-backed chair, his fingers stained with ink and cinnamon, his attention drifting between a steaming plate and the rhythmic tapping of his steward's tally stick. He is not cruel, not in the way men at sea would define it, but he is distant, removed. When he speaks, speaks of galleons, he does so with the same detachment one might use to describe the weather. The Santa Maria docked at midday, he says, barely pausing between mouthfuls. The silver is intact. 3 chests short, but that's within acceptable loss margins. Someone chuckles softly at the table. Acceptable loss. A polite phrase for sailors buried in foreign sand, for broken masts and vanishing hulls. The phrase tastes better when paired with roast lamb and cream-soaked rice. Around the room, other men nod. These are not pirates nor soldiers. They are bankers, cloth importers, gold assessors. Their hands are soft. Their boots are clean. They sit beneath oil paintings of saints and sea battles they never fought in, beside shelves lined with bound ledgers, each containing columns of ink that tally everything from ship weights to cargo value to projected tax deductions. The empire in this room is a matter of arithmetic, and yet the silver has a scent. No amount of polish can remove it entirely. A dull metallic sharpness that lingers in the crates and the coins, even in the fingers of the steward who touches them. It is the scent of distance of jungle mines and slave labor and saltwater decay. The merchant knows this. He simply chooses not to dwell on it. The guests eat slowly. Courses arrive in gentle rhythm. Chilled melon in wine syrup, duck glazed in honey, bread baked with olives and rosemary. Every bite is a celebration of absence, the absence of hunger, of need, of worry. Outside, beggars crouch beneath the window ledges. Children chase dogs through alleys behind the villa. But within these walls, the empire is complete. The empire is delicious. In the corner of the hall, a hired musician plucks a vihuela, its notes soft and lilting. He is paid not to sing only to fill the silence so that no one is forced to speak too long about the weather, or the missing chests, or the rumors of a mutiny aboard the San Esteban. That name floats in the air, half-formed, then disappears beneath the scent of grilled peaches and sugar. Later, the merchant retires to his study. He removes his rings, washes his hands in rosewater, and examines the day's ledgers by candlelight. One line catches his eye. A note in the margin. Ship overdue. Maybe lost. He stares at it briefly, then draws a line through it with red ink. He will have his accountant revise the expected income to reflect a delay, not a loss. His mind moves to other matters. A potential marriage for his niece. A problem with spice shipments from Lisbon. Whether the new tapestries ordered from Flanders will arrive in time for the winter reception. He does not dream of the sea. He dreams of quiet courtyards and warm blankets and the safe lock click of a vault, sealing close for the night. And yet, somewhere in the house, beneath the floorboards or behind a hanging textile, there's always a reminder. A coin dropped by a servant, a crate lid stored for later use, the ghost of sea mold clinging to an imported chest. Because every luxury in the room, from the golden threaded curtain tassels to the silver-rimmed goblet beside his bed, came through the sea. Came through men who died face down in water, who drowned with oaths still in their mouths and salt still in their lungs. Not that the merchant is unaware. He reads the letters. He hears the news, but he tells himself it is part of the cost. And costs, to him, are comforting. They are calculable, measurable, nothing to fear. Back in the hall, the plates are cleared. The guests depart. A servant opens the front door to let the cool night breeze pass through the villa. From somewhere outside, a church bell rings. It tolls 8 times, slow and solemn. The merchant hears it, but pays it no mind. For him, it is simply evening. For others, miles away, that bell would have marked a change of shift. A time to row, a time to bleed, a time to wonder if they would ever reach the world he lives in. But he does not think of them. He lights another candle. He opens a new ledger. The empire must be balanced. The merchant's home does not sleep when he does. Even as he slips into embroidered linens and listens to the soft hiss of the courtyard fountain, the house remains alive in silence. Inside are 4 coined silver rails, slightly misshapen, stamped with the cross of Castile. He fingers them once, twice, then tucks them into a knot in the beams. He's not stealing, not yet. He's hiding them from the steward who's begun counting more aggressively. The coins came from an overpayment at the market, or so he told himself. And besides, he thinks the merchant would never notice. They are taught Latin and scripture, but rarely geography. Their understanding of the world ends at the garden wall. They do not know that the wood of their toy chests came from Brazilian jungles, or that the sugar in their porridge was once carried by men who could barely stand. They are not unkind. They are only untouched. Their hands do not tremble when they hold a coin. Their dreams do not include water. A roasted game hen with cloves and black pepper. A favorite, the moment passes. But not entirely. It's a thimbleful of water from a river of gold. All across Seville, similar homes sit behind similar gates. Porters unload ships in darkness, sweating beneath tar-streaked lanterns. Women scrub the stone floors of shipping houses. Children press their faces to shuttered shops, dreaming of warm bread or a dropped coin. In the back alleys, traders whisper of vessels gone missing, of crates rerouted, of a new supply of silver that may or may not be cursed. Marble courtyards, vine-draped archways, guest rooms prepared for men of rank. And in each one, the same paradox hums, a civilization fed by suffering, desperate to remain unaware of the very mechanism that sustains it. His dreams are of inventory, of tile baths, of order. He will wake to news of another galleon arriving, or another gone silent. He will nod, update the books, and eat figs on the terrace. Servants move through hallways with practiced discretion, setting out fruit for the morning, folding garments left carelessly on a chair, polishing candle holders that still carry the scent of foreign beeswax. But they will continue to appear in his life in the sheen of a cup, the cut of a gem, the weight of a gold chain around his son's neck. Always present, never mentioned. As above, so below. Where the merchant tallies casks and crates, his staff track leftover bread, buttons, and favored looks from visiting nobles. He speaks of a crew that turned on its captain, of a hidden bay where gold was buried, of a boy found clutching a bone dice, dead from thirst beside a broken cask. The room grows still. The guests hold their goblets a little tighter. Someone coughs. A steward drops a spoon. What can be kept? What must be seen? Who is watching? To feel the deck move underfoot. But the thought doesn't last long. He has no desire to suffer. Only to taste, in theory, the thing he's built his world upon. Behind the tapestries, in the walls, and down the tiled servants' stairs, the night carries on in whispers. Not from guilt, he doesn't think of it that way, but from restlessness. He walks through his study, trailing his fingers across the spines of account books, eyes catching briefly on a list of outstanding ship returns. One line, expected from Veracruz, delayed. He adds a note, review status in 30 days. Then closes the book and pours a glass of wine. And yet, if you ask the master of the house, he might say the house is at rest. Because to him, the only sounds that matter are the ones made in his presence. Downstairs, in a pantry barely taller than a man, a servant holds a small cloth pouch. This is the quiet arithmetic that happens beneath the empire's surface. In the upper corridors, the merchant's wife walks softly in heeled slippers, checking the locks on the shutters. She says little during the day, but at night her mind is awake. She knows of the rumor slaves taken from the galleons and sold privately through quiet brokers. She knows which families launder their coin through silk guilds, which priests dine twice a week on meat paid for by taxes meant for the poor. Her own husband avoids such entanglements, or so he claims. But the truth is, money moves like smoke. It finds cracks. Sometimes she watches the lamps from the tower balcony. Below, Seville stretches like a quilt of rooftops and bells. The Guadalquivir River glows faintly, carrying the last scent of salt from the sea. She wonders how many bodies have passed through its waters, how many chests of gold, and whether any of it ever truly rests. The family's children sleep in feather beds under painted ceilings. The merchant's household is not unique. But awareness slips through, sometimes, in unexpected ways. At one banquet, a guest, a minor noble with a fondness for storytelling, begins to recount a recent voyage he helped fund. The merchant laughs too loudly, breaking the tension. He turns the story into a joke, nudges the noble toward another tale, and signals for the next course. That night, The merchant finds himself unable to sleep. Some part of him wonders what it would feel like to stand on one of those ships. Just once. To see the horizon with nothing in the way. And outside, in the city beyond the villa's walls, Seville pulses with quiet activity. The docks do not sleep. No one speaks of the sea with affection, only with respect, fear, and calculation. Back in the villa, the candles burn low. The merchant has returned to bed. You will never know the names of the men who loaded the crates, or the boys who died below deck, or the carpenter whose arm was lost securing the hold during a storm. This was the cost of an empire run by silence. The less said, the smoother the balance, the cleaner the villa, the sweeter the wine, and as the silver flowed inland and the lives that earned it dissolved into waves, the halls of Seville remained dry, scented with spices and rose oil, sealed tight against the wind. Chapter 5. Bleeding, Leeches, and Shipboard Surgery Segment 1. There are sounds on a galleon that no sailor ever forgets. The crack of canvas in high wind, the groan of timbers under stress, the sudden silence before a squall. But among them, one sound lingers in the mind long after the voyage ends, the creak of a chair in the surgeon's corner. It wasn't the sound itself that chilled the blood. It was what came next. A muffled prayer, the clink of metal, the wet slap of a rag soaked in rum. Medical care at sea was not a science. It was an act of survival mixed with ceremony, wrapped in faith, and delivered by men who were usually barbers first, surgeons second, and doctors. Not at all. On most galleons, the chirurgeon, as they were sometimes called, was a man with steady hands and an iron stomach. He kept his tools in a wooden chest that smelled of dried blood and cloves. Inside were saws, hooks, awls, and a few oddly delicate instruments that might have once been used for dental work but now doubled as probes and extractors. There was no antiseptic, no anesthesia, and no understanding of germs or bacteria. Pain was part of the treatment, not a thing to be removed. In fact, the more a man screamed, the more confidence it gave the others that the surgery might be working. Imagine, for a moment, that you're the one sent to the surgeon's corner. You've been struck by a loose pulley, or perhaps a splinter of wood driven deep into your calf during a storm. The wound is red, warm to the touch, and starting to smell faintly of rot. The bosun sends 2 men to carry you down. You try to walk, but your leg won't bend. As you descend the narrow stairs, the light dims. You can already hear the sound of metal tapping on wood. The surgeon does not look up. He gestures to a barrel covered with a canvas rag and tells you to sit. Someone holds your shoulders. Another man, one you don't recognize, stands nearby with a flask of rum. The surgeon examines your wound. He hums a little as he works, not out of joy, just a habit. His beard is stained. His sleeves are rolled. He does not ask if you're ready. He only says, "Don't move." And then it begins. The first cut is the worst. Always. The knife is sharp but not clean. He works quickly, slicing away flesh turned black by infection. You bite your tongue. You taste blood. The pain floods you, then recedes, then returns again like a tide. The surgeon murmurs something about the leg being savable. That's good, you think, or maybe not. If it were gone, at least the pain would be too. He applies a hot iron to seal the wound. It hisses, you scream. The man with the rum pours a bit on the wound, then into your mouth. It does little but sting and burn in different ways. There are no bandages, only strips of sailcloth boiled in vinegar. He wraps you tightly, binds the leg to a splint, and nods to the others. You are carried back to your hammock. The rest is up to time. Not all injuries were so dramatic. Some began quietly. A swollen gum here, a discolored patch of skin there. Scurvy was a slow thief, stealing strength a little each day. Gums bled, teeth loosened, joints stiffened, and wounds refused to heal. The cure fresh fruit was rarely available. Lemons, limes, oranges, luxuries that disappeared after the first week at sea. In their place came vinegar, weak broth, or on rare occasions, dried citrus peel saved from earlier voyages. But most of the time, the cure came too late. The surgeon's answer to illness was often bleeding. A small incision in the arm, a cup to collect the blood, a prayer to restore balance. Leeches were prized. Not because they worked, but because they were something to do. Men would lie still while the creatures fed, watching the dark stain spread across the cloth beneath them. Some said it felt good, like pressure leaving the body. Others said it made their dreams darker. When things were desperate, teeth were pulled without ceremony. The barber's pliers doubled as dental tools. No numbing, just a strong grip, a twist, and the sound of enamel snapping free. Men were told to bite leather, but some bit through their own tongues. For wounds too deep or limbs too far gone, amputation was the only answer. There was no formal preparation. The surgeon would announce his decision in the morning, often after inspecting the wound with the tip of a quill. If you were lucky, you were too fevered to understand. If not, you were given rum, then held down by 4 men, but the blade was sharp. The saw was quick. The bleeding was managed with cauterization, a hot plate pressed to the stump until it sizzled shut. The smell stayed with the crew for days, yet somehow some men survived. They limped. They groaned. They bore their scars like maps, each wound a reminder of where they'd been, what they'd lived through, and who they'd seen vanish beside them. The surgeon rarely spoke of failure. He kept a book, marking names, wounds, treatments. Beside some, a small cross. Beside others, a blank space, names never asked, just bodies dumped into the sea. There were moments of tenderness, too. A bandage changed carefully. A small coin placed in the palm of a dying man, so he might pay passage to the next world. A quiet song hummed while stitching a wound. Even the surgeon, hardened by death and routine, sometimes paused to close a dead man's eyes with surprising gentleness. But these were brief flickers in a world where pain was expected and mercy came in short supply. No one was guaranteed healing, only the chance at another day. And so the galleon sailed on, heavy with its wounded, trailing prayers and moans behind it like a wake. The ocean did not care. The sky did not answer. But within the dark belly of the ship, beneath crates of gold and chests of armor, men clung to life through spit, blood, and silent endurance. Surviving a shipboard surgery was just the beginning. What came after it? The slow days, the sideways glances, the whispered prayers was its own form of trial. They walked with carved crutches or stumps wrapped in cloth. One man fashioned himself a wooden hand from scrap planks, crude and blocky, with iron nails for fingers. He didn't speak much, but the tapping of his prosthetic against the deck became its own kind of rhythm, a reminder of where he'd been and what it had cost. Superstition ran deep on these ships, and injury could mean more than physical weakness. Others hid them under scarves, long sleeves, or quiet lies. A missing toe became a birth defect. A jagged gash across the face was blamed on a tavern brawl. The truth that it had been a rat bite gone wrong or an infected rope burn was less romantic. So it was reshaped, reworded, folded into legend. They walked with their eyes a little lower, having once stared too long into whatever place the mind drifts during long deliriums. They remembered the names of men who had died beside them in the dark, sweating into the same blanket, breathing the same thick air. A man struck twice by illness was said to carry bad luck. On some ships he was feared. A necessary evil. A ship's surgeon who once saved a man's life by draining his wound with a brass straw became, in later versions, a wizard who could draw poison out with his gaze. Another who used brandy to flush a festering wound was rumored to have invented an elixir that cured madness. None of it was true. The stitch learned to climb again, slower than before. The limping took shorter routes. The disfigured kept their heads down. Every moment carried the possibility of pain. Every sound, a crack, a groan, a wet cough, could be the start of something irreversible. Life aboard a galleon didn't stop for the broken. It simply absorbed them into its rhythm. But in a place where time stretched and facts bent, the crew accepted these things. To jump overboard was madness. To beg for pity was useless. And so they pressed on, bent, bandaged, sometimes half blind, though breathing. Always breathing. Better to live with myth than stare too long into reality. On others, he was respected as a kind of grim guardian. one who had seen more of death than any soldier, yet still poured vinegar on wounds with steady hands. He was rarely invited to drink with the crew. His presence reminded them of weakness. He smelled of metal and mold. And when he touched your arm, it usually meant something was about to be taken from you. One who bled during a storm might be blamed for calling the wind. And if he asked you to bite down a strap of leather, you didn't ask why. There were men whose injuries seemed to follow them, falling mast one voyage, broken ribs the next. Eventually, no one wanted to bunk near them. They were whispered about. Avoided. On a Spanish galleon, healing was not a private affair. Every hammock was strung beside another. Every groan echoed down the timber corridors. The young boy who pulled salted meat from barrels with bare hands now refused to touch anything but bread. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others spoke too much, telling the same story over and over, as if trying to hold the world together with repetition. A leg that once bent easily now stayed rigid. A shoulder refused to lift. One man kept a chicken feather in his boot, convinced it kept away leg cramps. Another tied knots in his beard for every week he survived. When a man recovered from a near-fatal illness, the others rubbed his hammock rope 3 times before his shift changed for luck, they said, or maybe just for continuity. The ship became a kind of floating convalescence ward, patched together with salt, sweat, and the grim resolve of men who couldn't go anywhere else. No one was sent home. There was no hospital to retreat to. You either got better at sea, or you didn't. There was no such thing as a quiet recovery. And time was measured not in weeks or kindness, but in rations, rotations, and the slow shuffle toward the next port. If a man couldn't pull his weight, others would quietly rearrange the duties around him, at first with understanding, and later with resentment. A one-armed sailor was a burden. A limping deckhand slowed the line, yet they stayed. Because the sea had taken too much from them for land to offer anything else, pain was shared, and so was the awkwardness of returning to duty visibly altered. A limb gone, or a face stitched back together by candlelight. The men who survived amputations often became a different kind of presence on board. Others weren't so lucky. Some healed wrong. Bones set poorly, wounds reopened, infections returned. There was pity, sometimes, but not often. Compassion wore thin over long voyages. And then there was the fear, not of pain, but of being marked. Scars became symbols. Some sailors wore them proudly, calling them medals from Neptune himself. The surgeon, too, became the subject of whispered myth. But he was listened to, always. If he said rest, you rested. If he said drink more water, you obeyed. Sickness, too, left scars. Those who survived fevers were changed, thinner, shakier, and not all wounds were visible. The carpenter who once sang sea shanties during storms now sat quietly by the mast, carving spirals into the same block of wood for hours. To cope, the crew created rituals, small, strange habits to ward off pain. Stories traveled faster than truth. And beneath it all, the galleon sailed on. The wounded staggered back into duty, and always there was the fear of the next injury. A slipped knife, a spar unhooked, a sudden cough that didn't go away. Yet they endured, not because they believed they would survive, but because survival was the only option left. The sea offered no other exit. Somehow, that was enough. Chapter 6. Smuggling, Stowaways, and Secret Cargo. Not everything on a Spanish galleon was declared. For every chest stamped with the royal seal and every barrel logged in the captain's manifest, there was something else tucked behind crates, buried beneath ballast, or carried in by hands that knew how to stay out of sight. Officially, these ships were engines of empire, hauling gold, silver, spices, and cloth across the Atlantic in the name of the crown. But unofficially, they were markets unto themselves. Smuggling wasn't just a crime, it was a tradition. A quiet economy layered beneath the official one, where private trade and shadowed deals floated alongside cannonballs and communion wine. Everyone knew it happened, and everyone, in their own way, participated. The ship's cook, for example, might be hiding a handful of cinnamon sticks in a sack marked flour. The first mate might have a set of illegal ivory combs tucked into the lining of his sea chest. Even the priest might carry a pouch of saffron, sealed inside a book's hollowed-out pages, destined for a convent that had grown fond of fragrant prayers. And below deck, among the barrels and coils of rope, sometimes there was a person. Stowaways weren't always discovered right away. The lower hold was dark, crowded, and rarely checked unless the ship was unloading. A boy could hide behind crates for days if he had water and stayed quiet. A woman disguised in rags might be mistaken for a sick crew member. Sometimes the crew knew and said nothing, especially if the stowaway came with money or favors. There are records of escaped servants, runaway slaves, and even minor nobles trying to flee debts or disgrace by vanishing onto outbound ships. One captain claimed he found a stowaway only after she gave birth during a storm. The child was later baptized using water from a leaky cask and a spoon for a font. No one asked how she got aboard. No one wanted the paperwork. Then there were the secret passengers who weren't exactly stowaways, but weren't officially listed either. Envoys with sealed letters. Exiled priests. Merchants with names changed just enough to avoid taxes. These figures traveled quietly, sleeping in makeshift cabins, their meals brought by trusted stewards. If asked, the crew would shrug. Just a courier, they might say. Just a translator. But behind those plain labels were often lives packed with danger or intrigue. They were being moved not just across an ocean, but across legal lines, safely, silently. The real treasure wasn't always gold. Silk, forbidden books, rare seeds, even pigments that could fetch 10 times their weight in paint. These were often hidden inside larger shipments. The trick was in the packaging. One crate marked candles might contain beeswax soaked with powdered ambergris. A cask labeled oil might hide tiny packets of crushed lazuli, sealed in wax and wrapped in sailcloth. Even livestock weren't always what they seemed. A goat might be carrying a velvet pouch sewn into its belly fur. A hen might be laying unusually heavy eggs, hollowed shells filled with pearls. Creative smugglers turned the very structure of the ship into their hiding place. False bottoms in water barrels. Hollow beams in the cargo hold. One vessel was found to have an entire false wall that opened with the press of a loose nail inside were stolen navigational charts. Banned poetry and a gold crucifix believed to have been looted from a Jesuit mission. The risks were high. If discovered, punishment was swift. Smugglers might be flogged, marooned, or simply vanish in the night, but the rewards were often too tempting to ignore. A single pouch of contraband nutmeg could be worth more than a sailor's 6-month wage. A rare manuscript, if delivered safely to a scholar in Amsterdam or Florence, might change hands for a year's worth of rent on a merchant villa. The captains, of course, had their own system. Some turned a blind eye for a fee. Others took a cut. And a few went further, organizing smuggling networks from the quarterdeck. These were not pirates, not in the traditional sense. But they blurred the line with every voyage, sailing under the crown's banner, while selling goods that the crown had never seen. And still, the empire functioned, because it needed to. Because the wealth poured in regardless, and the paperwork at the ports smoothed over anything inconvenient. A missing crate? Lost at sea. A miscounted barrel? A scribe's error. A passenger unaccounted for? He must have disembarked earlier than planned. But not all secrets stayed hidden. There's a case from 1581 that lingered in sailor gossip long after the ship went down. A galleon called La Sagrada Fortuna was stopped for inspection in Havana. Officials noted the cargo seemed light to a few crates for a vessel of its size. Suspicious, they ordered a full search. Beneath a floor panel in the captain's cabin, they found 6 bolts of forbidden Chinese silk, a chest of smuggled tobacco, and 3 passengers chained together, their mouths gagged with linen. The captain claimed ignorance. Said they must have been placed there by the crew. Said the chains were for security. He was detained. The ship impounded. But before a full hearing could be held, the dock where the ship was moored caught fire. No witnesses survived. The case was closed, the name struck from records. And yet, among sailors, the story lived on. They say the fire was no accident. They say the chains were real. and that one of the passengers had a ring worth more than the ship itself. These were the stories traded in hammocks at night, half whispered over cold meat and stale bread. The lesson was always the same. The ship carried more than what the manifest said, and sometimes the most dangerous cargo had nothing to do with treasure. The hidden things aboard a galleon didn't always stay hidden. Sometimes it was a shift in the way someone walked, just slightly more careful, more guarded. Sometimes it was a whiff of something that didn't belong clove, sandalwood, cardamom smells far too luxurious for the cargo manifest. Then came the subtle shift. Someone's bunk was moved closer to the hold. A rope accidentally frayed, a mess left behind for someone else to clean. The ones who trafficked in quiet goods also traded in information. Who'd gotten an extra ration? Who snuck a second helping of wine? Who'd been seen whispering too long near the hatch to the lower hold? This network wasn't formal, but it was as rigid as any naval hierarchy. And once you were inside it, there was no leaving cleanly. He wasn't a real candle maker. That was just the name they gave him because he smelled of wax and kept a bundle of tallow sticks in his chest. No one knew why he dejoined the crew. He didn't to speak of his past, but he was generous with favors and could stitch a wound better than the surgeon. Everyone liked him. Until someone found a necklace under his hammock gold, delicate, clearly valuable, far above a sailor's pay. The tension built slowly, like pressure inside a sealed cask, until eventually someone snapped. Some were discovered accidentally when the ship hit a swell and muffled cry escaped their grain sacks. Others revealed themselves after falling ill, crawling out in search of help with eyes sunken and lips cracked. Some were locked in the brig until the next port. Others were thrown overboard. It was never shown to anyone. It lived in a pouch tied beneath their shirt or inside the lining of their coat. If they died, the list died with them. And sometimes this silence was the only thing that kept a voyage from turning into a floating scandal. Some were offloaded with the rest of the goods, carried away in ox carts and wagons to the cities inland. Others remained fragments of letters, names carved into beams, faint perfume in the air near the spice barrels. And some secrets remained stitched into memory. The crew member who disappeared, the package no one claimed, the silence in the captain's voice when the officials asked if this was everything, or handed off to authorities that asked no questions and gave no receipts. Their names didn't enter the log. Their stories ended quietly, swallowed by salt and protocol. Some came armed, convinced they could buy their freedom, and threats. Most were just desperate. He said nothing. They gave him a chance to explain. He didn't flinch, not because it was hidden, but because it was normal. Expected, built into the ship's very structure. A compartment here, a false wall there. A hidden crawl space designed not for cargo, but for concealment. Scrubbing the deck, mending sails, carrying slop to the pigs in the livestock crates. They'd sleep near the rats, under tarps strung over barrels. They wouldn't be paid. They wouldn't be trusted, but they'd live. And then the captain's steward found a packet of folded silk under the floorboard near the galley silk, threaded with pearls. The connection was made, whether it was true or not. Miguel was put ashore at the next port with no pay and no record. Just a sack of bread and the boots he'd come in with. The crew never saw him again. The silk vanished from the conversation. The necklace was never reported. And yet, a week later, the cook got a new set of knives, and the bosun began wearing a polished gold ring. And when they did, it wasn't always the guilty one who paid. And far too dangerous if traced back to the wrong barrel. It kept the ship moving. It kept the food from running out. It kept the arguments from becoming mutinies. Suspicion had a smell of its own, like old rope and damp parchment. And once it settled into the ship's bones, it rarely left quietly. He allowed certain men to bend the rules because those men kept order in ways he couldn't. They calmed fights, enforced silence, and warned him discreetly when something truly dangerous was about to happen. He gave them space. In return, they gave him peace. No one ever shouted accusations. That wasn't how it worked. It began with a glance during supper, a whispered joke between hammocks. There was a kind of unspoken economy of trust on board. Every man owed someone something. a favor, a secret, a silence. The captain knew it too. He could pretend the ship was orderly, that the ledger told the truth, that the sails obeyed, but below deck, he ruled by compromise. But even peace has a cost. There were moments when the web of secrets collapsed. A misplaced crate, a stowaway discovered dead in a water barrel, a package opened by mistake, revealing letters not meant for any port on the ship's route. And when that happened, the crew braced itself, not for justice, but for chaos. The punishment rarely matched the crime. Guilt was not always proven. Sometimes the man with the quietest hands and the least suspicious eyes was the one dragged out by the collar and chained to the mast. One case still whispered about is that of Miguel, the candleman. They questioned him. No one said a word. That was the currency of silence on a galleon. Everyone bought and sold it, even if they pretended otherwise. Stowaways were trickier. Their presence was personal. A smuggled spice might inconvenience the manifest, but a human being in the hold was dangerous in a different way. If they were found early and the captain was in a forgiving mood, they might be put to work. If they were found later after rations were tight or tempers frayed, they were a liability. Some captains kept a secret list, a second manifest. It included unofficial passengers, hidden goods, off-record debts. There's something haunting about the scale of it all. By the time the ship reached its destination, most of the secrets had shifted. Because even if the ink was dry, the answer was never yes. It was always everything we can account for. And then the officials would nod, sign their forms, and let the ship pass. Chapter 7. The Manila Galleon Trade and Silent Slaves of the Sea. It's easy to think of the Spanish Empire as something Atlantic-bound galleons from Havana, silver from Potosi, gold-bound for Seville. But across the vast, humming silence of the Pacific, another artery pumped wealth into the empire's heart. It began in Manila in the Philippines, and it ended in Acapulco, on the western coast of New Spain. The journey stretched for nearly 5 months longer than any crossing from Europe. It was the great trans-Pacific thread, known to merchants and monarchs alike as the Manila Galleon Trade, and it was brutal. The ships that sailed this route were fewer in number, but massive in scale. Great floating warehouses, slow and heavy, bloated with silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and spices, cargo light in weight but heavy in value. A single galleon could carry an empire's fortune in its hold and lose it all in a single wave. So they packed them tight, with treasure, with sailors, and with something else, people. You would not find their names on any ledger, not officially. But they were there, bound in silence, tucked behind the language of personal servant or indentured aid. Men and women, often taken from port cities across Southeast Asia, Malay, Tagalog, Tamil, Khmers on seas during raids, others purchased in markets that claimed not to be slave markets. Once aboard, they became part of the ship's fabric. They cooked. They scrubbed. They baled water with their bare hands. They were beaten if they moved too slowly. They were ignored when they wept. No records survive of how many perished during the crossing, because they were rarely recorded to begin with. The voyage from Manila to Acapulco was notoriously cruel, not just for the enslaved, but for everyone. The ships left Manila between June and August, when the monsoon winds were most favorable. The crossing could take 4 to 6 months. Water was rationed to a few sips per day. Rice, salted fish, and hard biscuits filled with weevils became the only meals. Rats were eaten, eventually. Leather belts soaked in broth became soup. Disease came early and stayed long. Scurvy, again. Dysentery. Fevers with no name. And across it all, heat dents. Wet heat that soaked every hammock, turned breath into steam, and left bodies limp before the sun had reached its highest. To pass the time, the crew carved dice from bone, sang in languages that shared no grammar, gambled with pebbles and bits of colored string. But below deck, the enslaved passengers had no such escape. They were not allowed up. If they grew sick, they died in the dark. If they cried out, they were silenced. And if they survived, no one wrote about them. Some years later, appear in fragments, small notes and letters, whispered memories in monastery records. A quiet Tamil man seen serving tea in Mexico City. A woman with eyes like lacquer baptized in Oaxaca, but their stories are shadows. Their presence was not meant to be remembered. And that silence over centuries grew deeper than the Pacific itself. The Spanish crown knew what it was doing. The Manila trade was lucrative, too lucrative to interrupt with moral questions. Silk from China, carried through Manila, fetched 20 times its value in New Spain. Spices from the Moluccas, once monopolized by the Portuguese, now poured through Spanish ships. Lacquer chests, ivory fans, ornate porcelain, all symbols of far wealth, displayed proudly in noble homes across the Americas. And behind each of them, a journey that broke thousands of lives. There was no escort fleet, no protection. These galleons sailed alone across the biggest stretch of ocean on Earth. Pirates rarely followed them too far, too long. Storms were the real enemy. Cyclones near Guam, rogue waves in mid-ocean. One galleon lost in 1601 was later found years afterward, its wreckage washing up in chunks on the coast of Baja California, bits of blue and white porcelain, a severed mast. And tucked inside a waterproof lacquer box, a letter addressed to a merchant in Manila. It had never been opened. And yet, for all the suffering, the ships kept sailing. Because the trade was too rich. The taxes collected in Acapulco funded churches, roads, and palaces. The coins struck from it built shrines and statues. And every merchant in Seville who dealt in lace or sugar or books had, at some point, held something that crossed that Pacific divide. Some captains brought families with them, wives, children, servants trying to simulate normalcy aboard a floating furnace. But the presence of women brought its own tensions. Jealousy, possession, quiet violence behind cabin doors. One woman's diary, discovered in a Jesuit archive in Puebla, speaks briefly of a girl from the islands who sleeps under the stairs. They say she has no tongue, but she speaks with her eyes. That line ends without explanation. The diary turned to a recipe for boiled yams. The girl is never mentioned again. Even after the galleons reached Acapulco, their hidden passengers remained unseen. Most were sold into domestic labor, absorbed into wealthy households under Christian names. Some were baptized and disappeared into the language of the colony. Others fled into the hills or melted into local communities, their origins slowly erased by time, marriage, and silence. But a few left marks. In markets in Mexico City, vendors still sold pickled ginger long before anyone knew how it got there. Certain weaving patterns in Puebla resemble motifs from Southeast Asia. A lullaby still sung in parts of Oaxaca uses a melody nearly identical to one from Old Luzon. These are the fragments. Cultural fingerprints left by those who were never meant to leave them. The sailors, too, bore scars. They returned to Spain thinner, angrier, with skin like leather and eyes that flinched at sudden noise. They told stories of storms with mouths full of broken teeth. They didn't speak of the passengers, but they never forgot them either. And back in Manila, the cycle began again. The warehouses refilled. The agents whispered offers in port cities from Makassar to Madras. Crates were packed. Contracts signed. And the next galleon, already named and blessed, waited with sails like folded parchment, ready to vanish over the horizon. Because the route had to stay alive. The sea demanded it. The empire depended on it. And silence, as always, was the easiest currency. The journey across the Pacific left marks not always visible in the body, but etched deep into the rhythm of life that followed. For many, the voyage ended with survival. For others, it was only the beginning of a quieter captivity, one that wrapped itself not in chains, but in customs, language, and the slow erasure of origins. A woman called Amara in the port of Cebu might arrive in Mexico under the name Maria. A boy named Tin could become Tomas, his language unspoken, his customs drowned in catechism and linen collars. To survive, many complied. Some resisted quietly by teaching their children fragments of songs, by planting herbs from memory, by whispering prayers not found in any church. Once the cargo was unloaded, the crew paid, and the names written into customs books, the unofficial passengers, were sorted through with less ceremony than livestock. A former carpenter, now a friar in Valladolid, described in one letter how he remembered a boy with burn marks on his shoulders who used to help him sharpen tools below deck. He never spoke, the friar wrote, only watched. I never asked his name. At certain inland missions in Mexico, there appeared patterns of prayer that didn't match local traditions. A cross carved with circles, a chant that ended with a syllable closer to Sanskrit than Spanish, but the trail was fragmented. Church records lacked surnames. Port logs used nicknames or racial slurs. The Manila archives burned in uprisings, and the Acapulco docks rebuilt too many times to preserve the ledgers. A new generation of crew boarded, and the cycle repeated. The age of sail was ending. New ships, faster and colder in design, would soon crisscross the oceans. But no other trade route before or since would stretch so far for so long and do so much in such silence. Somewhere out there, beneath thousands of meters of pressure and time, lie the ribs of ships, the cries of the forgotten, and the silver weight of stories never told. Not lost, just waiting. In time, the trade would wane, strained by wars, pirate threats, and rising cost. But for over 2 centuries, it defined a corridor of pain dressed in silk. What remains are fragments enough to suggest enormity, but never enough to name it fully. Some friars dismissed these as errors in catechism. Others, quietly, began documenting them. In a lullaby with unfamiliar cadences. In the arch of an eyebrow that doesn't match the family line. In the sea itself, which remembers everything. In another document, a merchant described how he inherited a servant named Lucia from his father's estate, only to realize many years later that she had been brought aboard. Contraband. She laughed often, he wrote, but never at the right things. Some were distributed as gifts. Others were purchased privately. And many, perhaps most, were simply absorbed without a word. The empire, like all empires, preferred clean numbers, signed manifests, and silence. If a sailor spoke too openly about what he'd seen, he wasn't punished. He simply wasn't asked to sail again. A hairpin made from coral found only in the Sulu Sea, worn by a baker's wife in Veracruz. A jar with a glaze unfamiliar to any local potter, buried with a family in Puebla. A woven belt passed down through generations in a village that swore it had always been there. These were not coincidences. They were footprints pressed softly, but not erased. And for many, that was enough. The sea had taken so much. Better not to risk it taking the rest. Others claimed storms would rise if a woman born east of the Moluccas was aboard during a full moon. In one famous case, a galleon called Nuestra Senora del Viento lost its entire mast during clear weather. The survivors blamed a stowaway girl from Siam. She had died 2 days earlier and been buried at sea without a priest's blessing. No one said her name after that. The next ship in the line carried an extra priest and began nightly prayers just in case. The law, officially, was clear. Slavery was forbidden within Spanish territories unless under specific exemptions, prisoners of just war or those unbaptized. But the law bent easily under wealth and distance. In Acapulco, a merchant could receive a personal attendant from Manila and register the transaction as a dowry supplement or repayment of debt. The hold was off limits to most. Only the steward, the surgeon, and the captain's chosen men entered. Rumors trickled out. A chained man with tattoos covering his chest. A girl who spoke 3 languages but refused to make eye contact. A baby who didn't survive the 3rd week. These became stories. Then half-stories. Then myths. Paperwork, when it existed, disguised the truth in layered euphemism. No one asked too many questions. Especially when silk was selling well and coin was flowing. For the enslaved, names were the first thing to vanish. Even the sailors who transported them sometimes didn't know the full extent of what they carried. Some crews developed superstitions. It was said that if a galleon carried more than 10 unrecorded souls, the ship would drift off course, no matter how steady the stars. But guilt, when it came, arrived in quiet forms. Some crewmen wrote confessions decades later, tucked inside letters never meant to be sent. No formal investigations were ever conducted. Still, there were traces, tiny ones, and there were objects. Historians, centuries later, would try to trace these lives, and through it all, the route continued. The wains came, the galleons departed. When the final Manila galleon arrived in Acapulco in the early 19th century, it carried porcelain, cinnamon, letters of farewell, and a dwindling crew. No monuments were built for those who were trafficked across the Pacific, no statues in city squares. But the evidence remains in quieter places. The Pacific, unlike the Atlantic, is wider, quieter, deeper, and it holds its secrets in stillness. Chapter 8, Star Charts and Nightmares of the Deep. There is no silence quite like the one that falls during night watch at sea. It is not the silence of peace, nor the hush of sleep. It is an alive kind of quiet, heavy, and listening. The galleon creaks softly beneath your feet, wood shifting against nails, sails rustling above like cloth ghosts. The ocean is black, unbroken, a smooth sheet of ink that stretches to nothing. And overhead, the stars. You are on the upper deck, wrapped in a damp wool cloak, your hands stiff with salt. The rest of the crew sleeps below, packed tight in their hammocks, breathing in rhythm. Up here, it is just you, the breeze, and the long, low hum of water slipping past the hull. The night is your companion. It sees everything and says, nothing. Navigating by stars is more than a skill. It's a kind of quiet worship. Each star has a name, Polaris, Vega, and Teres. Each constellation tells a story, some Ramang, some Arab, some whispered by sailors who never learned to read but memorized the heavens better than any book. The stars are constant. Their positions do not lie. They drift slowly across the sky with the turning of the earth, and from them, men chart their way home. But sometimes, the stars disappear. Clouds roll in from nowhere. A fog rises thick and pale. The world shrinks until all you can see is your own breath. Then even that vanishes. The compass spins. The wind dies. The ship groans in place like an old man trying to remember a name he has already forgotten. In those moments, when the stars are gone and direction has no meaning, fear enters the lungs like cold air. There are stories of ships that vanish during night watch, not in storms, not to pirates. Just vanished. One galleon, La Encantada, was last seen off the coast of Mindoro in 1627. The crew of a passing merchant vessel spotted her sails by moonlight. Then she passed into fog. When the fog lifted, she was gone. No wreckage, no bodies. Only a faint sound, like singing, that drifted over the water and then faded. The men who serve the night watch know better than to speak of such things openly. But the fear is there. Not loud, not wild, just quiet. Constant, like a line pulled tight below the surface. Sometimes there are shapes in the water. You might spot it just past the edge of your lanternous glow, a ripple too large for a fish, a shadow that doesn't match the wind. You tell yourself it's nothing, a drifting log, a pod of whales. You say it once, then again. Then you stop saying it altogether, because the worst part isn't seeing something strange. It's realizing you're the only one awake to see it. Night is when the sea tells its oldest stories. The kind that never made it into books. The sailors have their own names for the things they see. The watcher beneath, the walking reef, the lanternfish, which I tend to fish at all, but a ship-shaped glow seen on the horizon just before someone falls ill. No one knows where these names came from. They've always been there. Passed down in muttered tailies and strange carvings on the lower mast. You've seen them yourself, tiny figures etched into the wood, eyes too large, hands too thin. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe they're a map of something deeper. There's an old trick among night watchmen. When fear creeps too close, you count the stars. One by one. Find the North Star. Trace the curve of Orion's belt. Whisper the names like a prayer. If you can still name them, they say, then you haven't gone mad yet. On clear nights, the sky is dazzling, so full of light it makes the sea look darker by comparison. Shooting stars blaze overhead, and the Milky Way cuts a silver ribbon across the black. For a moment, you forget the cold. You forget the bruises on your shins and the pain in your back. You are just a dot on a wooden deck, drifting between stars and shadows. And strangely, that feels right. Then something brushes the hull. A soft thump. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. You lean over the edge, peering into the water. It's calm. But there, just below the surface, you catch a glimpse. Pale. Long. Moving too slowly to be fish. Then it's gone. You do not report it. You return to your watch. You resume counting stars. But the next time you glance down, you do not look too closely. The men who work these decks for years often develop strange habits. One insists on whistling a particular tune during his shift, claiming it keeps the fog at bay. Another refuses to look behind him while walking the length of the ship, as if afraid of what might be following. Some wear small charms, bits of bone, copper coins, braids of hair, not for fashion, for protection. You learn to respect these things, not because you believe in them, necessarily, but because belief itself has power on the open sea. Enough men fearing the same thing can make it real, or at least make it matter. And still the stars shine. No matter the stories, no matter the fear, the sky remains steady, endless, above the superstition, above the decks and the ropes and the creaking beams. The stars do not care about your fears. They do not blink. They simply exist, guiding the lost, mocking the found, marking time in a world that has none. You cling to them quietly, you chart your course, and you hope the sky holds. Because if it doesn't, if the stars disappear for good, then the ship is truly alone. And the sea will tell a new story. Sleep aboard a galleon was never restful, but it was essential. The crew worked in rotations, sleeping in short bursts between shifts, curled in damp hammocks or stretched across crates if the lower decks were full. But for those on the night watch, especially the ones who did it for weeks, months, or years, something changed. The stars became companions, yes, but also mirrors. They reflected back whatever the men carried in their minds. And over time, the line between light and shadow blurred. There were many reasons why men stopped sleeping. Some were practical. The rocking of the ship, the endless creaks, the closeness of other bodies, the choking humidity, the stink of rotting food or wet wood. But sometimes it was fear or something even softer and harder to explain, a quiet pull toward wakefulness, a reluctance to close one's eyes in a place where the world never stopped shifting. At first it was dismissed. He's just a light sleeper. He's got a bad back, but soon it became something else. Eyes bloodshot even at dawn, hands that shook when pouring water. Sudden bursts of laughter at nothing at all. Some sailors began speaking to things no one else could see, holding hushed conversations with shadows, arguing with knots in the rope, staring at the stars as if waiting for them to blink back. The surgeon had no cure. He called it night fever or deck trance. Recommended vinegar, prayer, cold water splashed on the face, but none of it helped. The sea did not heal what it broke slowly, and so these men became fixtures of the night, unassigned to duties, yet still present. Wandering the deck, mumbling charts to themselves, tying and untying the same line again and again, as if afraid it might come undone. One man, known as Miro, began scratching symbols into the wood of the aft rail. At first, the crew ignored it. Then, when his carvings grew larger circles, triangles, shapes no one recognized, the bosun ordered them sanded away. The next night, Miro carved them again, this time on the mast, then on the floor near the galley. When asked what they meant, he said only, "They're to remind the water who we are." No one asked a second time. Another sailor, Tomas, refused to speak after midnight. He would work, obey, even smile. But if spoken to during night watch, he would only raise a finger to his lips. Some thought it was a joke. Until the night, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The wind howling like it had teeth. Everyone was shouting. Everyone except Tomas. He stood at the helm, silent, eyes wide, one hand gripping the railing. Later, he said, "If you talk too loud at night, the sea hears you." And it doesn't forget. Not every man broke the same way. Some simply slowed. Their minds stayed sharp, but their thoughts moved like cold syrup. They took longer to answer, longer to react, longer to trust. You could see it in the way they watched others carefully, cautiously, as if every conversation were a riddle. They no longer believed in coincidence. A snapped rope was a warning. A dropped spoon, a sign. A gull circling the mast, a bad omen. Of course, most of this was kept quiet. There was no profit in acknowledging how close to the edge the crew lived. The officers knew that admitting one man had gone mad would invite scrutiny into the rest. So the strange behaviors were folded into routine. The man who hummed all night was assigned extra deck swabbing. The one who slept in the lifeboat was allowed to, as long as he didn't drift. The one who cried silently after sunset was given extra rum, no questions asked. Superstition grew stronger in the face of all this. Small rituals took root ways of keeping the madness at bay. Sailors tapped the mast 3 times before stepping onto the forecastle. Others muttered the names of family members while coiling rope. Some refused to look overboard after midnight. That's when the sea looks back, they'd say. A few drew symbols on the solace of their feet, convinced it kept their souls anchored to the ship. And still the stars watched, cold, silent, unmoving. There's something about being surrounded by sky and water that distorts time. A week feels like a month. A night feels like forever. The line between dream and memory thins. Some men claimed they saw lights beneath the ship, entire cities glowing beneath the waves. Others swore they heard music coming from the water, notes that didn't match any tune sung by the crew. One night, the lookout swore he saw another ship sailing alongside their black sails. No crew, perfectly silent. He blinked and it was gone. He never mentioned it again. These visions were dismissed by the officers as tricks of the sea, fatigue, imagination, and perhaps they were. But even the most rational men began to walk differently at night. More slowly, more carefully, as if they'd come to believe in things they could not name. What made it worse was the isolation. No matter how many men were aboard, night made them feel alone. Voices sounded thinner in the dark. Footsteps vanished. You could be surrounded by 30 men and still feel as though you were drifting through space. The ship became a world, and you, a quiet moon circling something massive and unknowable. Occasionally, the madness passed. A good sleep, a lucky wind, the sight of land on the horizon. A man would return to himself, blinking like someone stepping out of fog. But not always. Some remained trap functioning, yes, but never quite whole. They were given lighter duties, fewer night shifts, but they were watched and whispered about. When the voyage ended, those who survived carried the silence with them. They walked differently, stared longer at the sky. Some refused to sleep in enclosed rooms again. Others never set foot on a ship for the rest of their lives. They'd say it was because of the storms, or the food. But if pressed, a few would admit it was something else. Not fear, not exactly, but a knowing that the sea sees everything. And that once you've watched the stars long enough, they start watching back. Chapter 9. Punishment at Sea. Keel hauling and the lash. Discipline on a galleon was not a question. It was a fact. As constant as the tide, as harsh as the salt wind. It existed in the quiet glances between officers, the clipped tone of a command, the way men straightened their backs when the bosun passed by. There were rules, yes, written codes, articles of conduct signed by captains and enforced by the fleet. But the truth was simpler. Aboard a ship at sea, far from ports and courts, punishment was whatever the man in charge said it was. It began small. A missed chore, a drop bucket, a word spoken too sharply during inspection. For these offenses, the punishment was often verbal, a tongue lashing in front of the crew. A few extra hours scrubbing the deck, a skipped ration. But the line between minor and major infractions was never fixed. And it only took one step too far for discipline to turn into violence. Imagine you've been accused of theft. Perhaps you did it. Perhaps you didn't. It doesn't matter now. The bosun has your name, and your crewmates are silent. The charge is made at dawn, no trial, just a nod from the officer of the watch. A sentence is announced, and 2 men seize your arms. You are dragged to the main deck, where a grating has been pulled aside to reveal iron rings embedded in the planks. They tie your wrists, pull your shirt away. Your back is bare beneath the gray light of morning. The boatswain steps forward, holding a whip-nine leather cords knotted with iron. This is the cat o' nine tails. The first strike burns. The second tears? By the third, you stop counting. Each lash lands with a wet crack. The crew watches in silence. Some avert their eyes. Others watch with blank faces. No one speaks. No one dares. Because they know that tomorrow, it could be them. Afterwards, you're cut loose and left to crawl back below. If you're lucky, someone brings you vinegar to clean the wounds. If not, you heal on your own, one scar at a time. But flogging was only the beginning. For more serious offenses, mutiny, sabotage, striking an officer, there were other methods. Keel hauling was among the worst. Rare, yes, but real. A man sentenced to it was bound with rope, hands and feet, and dragged beneath the ship's hull from one side to the other. Slowly, deliberately, the barnacles on the hull were sharp as glass, hardened by years in salt water. As the body was pulled along them, skin tore, muscles shredded, salt rushed into open wounds. If he didn't drown first, he bled out soon after. The sea took the rest. This wasn't just punishment, it was performance. A reminder to every man watching that the ship had no patience for disobedience. Sometimes the punishments were more creative. A man who fell asleep on watch might be tied standing to the mast for 24 hours, lashed to it upright, his head covered with a soaked cloth that dried stiff in the sun. Another who insulted a priest was forced to kneel and recite prayers aloud for every man aboard, one by one, while the rest worked in silence. If he stumbled, the count began again. And yet, for all its cruelty, punishment was seen as necessary. A ship at sea was a fragile thing, held together not just by nails and sails, but by trust, fear, and routine. A single act of rebellion, one man refusing orders, one man hoarding food, could crack the whole thing wide open. So punishment had to be swift, public, total. There were those who took pleasure in it. The boatswain who smiled when he picked up the whip. The officer who gave more lashes than ordered, but they were few. Most carried out their duty with flat expressions, not because they lacked feeling, but because feeling made it worse. The lash was easier when detached, and the crew learned to keep their voices low, to obey even when it made no sense, to say yes before questioning, to move quietly, efficiently, invisibly. The worst part wasn't always the punishment itself. It was the silence that followed. No one spoke of what had happened. The man who had been flogged returned to duty, hunched, eyes hollow. The one who had been tied to the mast now avoided all sunlight. The one who had been accused of smuggling and thrown overboard without ceremony simply became an absence. His bunk was cleared, his bowl washed, his name never said again. And this silence, that eerie, heavy stillness, hung over the ship like mist. Not angry, not mournful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that made men age faster, sleep less, trust fewer faces. Even among friends, loyalty frayed. If a man was caught and blamed another, there was little recourse. Testimony meant little when survival was on the line. If someone said you were guilty, you were, and the lash followed. Yet the crew still found ways to resist. Small ones. A glance passed behind the officer's back. A bucket tipped too heavily. A nail bent wrong on purpose. Petty revenge. Symbolic acts. Because in a place where pain was given freely, silence became its own rebellion. A refusal to break even as the body did. The officers, of course, knew this. Some doubled down. Others tried to show fairness, sparing the lash for only the worst. A rare few earned genuine respect, but most relied on fear. Because fear, unlike respect, could be felt in the dark. And through it all, the ship sailed on. The waves didn't care who screamed or who wept or who bled into the planks. The wind didn't flinch at the crack of the whip. The sea swallowed every punishment like it did every storm with indifference. There was no escape, no port until the next destination. No trial but the judgment of men half-starved and sunburnt. And no one to hear the cries except the gulls, circling high above, waiting for something to die. Over time, discipline ceased to feel like correction and became part of the weather. Men no longer flinched at the sight of rope burns or blood on the deck. They stepped around bruises. They passed over groans. The lash no longer shocked them. It only confirmed that the ship was still functioning, still tight, still afraid, too much fear, and men broke. Too little, and they became bold. In these cases, the anticipation itself became the sentence. The accused would walk with hunched shoulders, eyes darting, each day wondering if this was the morning he'd be called forward. Some begged for the punishment to be carried out immediately, just to end the waiting. Others tried to prove themselves worthy of pardon, working harder, taking the blame for others, praying more loudly at morning mass. The officers walked that line carefully, maintaining just enough visible cruelty to keep order, while allowing small mercies to stop the crew from snapping entirely. You didn't show too much sympathy when someone was punished. You didn't help your crewmate because you liked him. You helped because if he failed, the blame might land on you. And that cooperation, though joyless, kept the ship running. Because pity, like rebellion, was contagious. And if you stood too close to the punished, the officers might begin to wonder whether you shared the same weakness. A job done deliberately wrong. A muttered insult that no one else claimed to hear. These small acts weren't meant to cause change. They were acts of self-preservation. Then gave both men 20 lashes and ended it there. Of memory, a reminder, however brief, that the crew were still human, and perhaps that was part of the design. The unpredictability was its own form of control. Not much, just a chunk of hard biscuit tucked inside a sleeve. It changed how the men were seen. Some were feared more after punishment. Others were pitied. A few, those who accepted the lash without a sound, became legends. The officer made an example of him, tied him to the mainmast, announced 30 lashes, and prepared the crew to watch. One former sailor, years after his final voyage, was asked what he feared most about the sea. He didn't mention storms or sharks or hunger. He just said, a quiet deck with no wind. When you know someone's about to scream. If a man cried out during flogging, no one mocked him. Aboard a galleon, it became a language. It taught the crew how to move, when to speak, who to trust. It made them efficient. Hardened? Silent. But it also made them brittle. Underneath the calm surface, each man carried a knot of fear, tightly wound and never released. Pain was not a weakness. But if he begged, pleaded, or accused others to save himself, he was marked forever. Not by the officers, by the crew. No one said anything aloud. But they remembered. They always remembered. Not just the pain. Not just the scars, but the anticipation, the waiting. The knowing that something sharp, swift, and final could arrive at any moment without warning. But just before the punishment began, another sailor stepped forward. He said the bread was his, that Mateo had been framed. Stealing food might cost you 20 lashes. Insulting an officer might get you 30. If someone dropped a crate, another would help lift it without a word. Not out of kindness, but out of shared danger. Survival wasn't individual. It was collective, enforced by the lash. Refusing to climb the rigging in bad weather could result in a broken finger or two. But when the injured men returned below, someone had left vinegar, cloth strips, and a bit of brandy by their hammocks. It wasn't mercy, it was balance. Quiet justice of a kind. But these numbers weren't fixed. They depended on the mood of the ship, the recent weather, the temperament of the bosun. Discipline wasn't mechanical. It was emotional. And fear, aboard a galleon, was a stabilizing force. The whip would rise and fall, and when it ended, everything would return to normal. The deck washed. The ropes coiled. The punished sent back to work. It was never spoken aloud, but every sailor knew the delicate balance they lived within. A certain knock on a barrel meant the officer was approaching. A hand placed on the shoulder during mess meant a secret was about to be shared. The galley became the place where rumors started and orders were questioned. But it all happened softly, carefully. One wrong word and the punishment would return. Occasionally, the lash was postponed. A punishment delayed until landfall or a more appropriate moment. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The reasons for reprieve were rarely explained. There was a strange economy of punishment on board. Certain infractions cost more than others, not in coin, but in flesh. And that made it worse. The men adapted. They developed codes, unspoken signals to warn each other. Even friendships were guarded. You didn't speak too freely with someone you didn't know well. You didn't share your past. But within this quiet, something else grew. Not trust, exactly. Something colder. A kind of cooperation forged in fear. They shared tools, they covered for each other's mistakes. They patched sails together without talking. And yet, among the fear, there were rare moments of defiance. A look held too long. In one voyage, a young sailor named Matteo was caught hoarding bread. Everyone knew he was lying, but the boatswain paused, looked from one to the other. Later that night, no one spoke. Such events were rare. Most punishments played out exactly as ordered. The crew would stand in forced silence, eyes forward, hands still. But the memory remained. Every scar became a symbol, a map of obedience, a badge that marked who had endured, who had crossed the line, and who had returned. There were rules even for that. And so the lash shaped more than just flesh. It shaped culture. Some never recovered. When they returned to land, they flinched at sudden sounds, avoided crowds, refused to sleep indoors. And perhaps that's what punishment truly did. Because on a ship in the middle of nowhere, discipline didn't come from law. It came from fear. And fear was always awake. Chapter 10, The Ghost Fleet of the Caribbean. As the Spanish Empire spread its sails across the Atlantic, it didn't just carry gold and goods. It also carried stories. Long nights on deck, broken compasses, rotting rations, these were the conditions where imagination stretched its legs. And nowhere did it stretch farther than in the Caribbean, a region sailors whispered about even before their ships crossed into its warmer winds. The waters there held more than just pirates and storms, they said. They held echoes. You wouldn't find these tales in the official logs. No record would ever admit a captain saw a ship with glowing sails. No officer would note that his crew refused to look starboard after midnight. But among the crew, especially those who had crossed those waters more than once, the stories were common currency. You didn't have to believe them, but you had to listen. It would usually begin like this. A man on night watch, rocking gently with the swell, spots a dark outline in the distance. No lights, no sound. Just a silhouette tall, proud sails against the moon. Maybe he calls out to the officer. Maybe he doesn't. The ship moves past slowly, just close enough to see the torn edges of canvas or the strange stillness of its deck. No voices, no crew, no anchor dropped. Just a drifting vessel, eerily intact. Then it's gone, swallowed by fog or shadow. And then, of course, the questions begin. Was it a derelict? A vessel abandoned after battle or plague? Or was it something else? The older sailors always had names for these sightings. The Santa Margarita, lost near Cuba during a storm, said to reappear each full moon. The San Ignacio, which vanished with 400 souls and all its treasure, now rumored to sail with no crew, only a burning lantern swinging from the bow. And most infamous of all, the Oration del Mar, the prayer of the sea, a galleon said to have made a deal with the devil to complete its voyage faster, only to be doomed to sail forever. No one admitted to believing such things, and yet routines changed when they entered the Caribbean. Night watches were doubled. Prayers were said more quietly but more often. Men who scoffed at superstition just days before began leaving tiny offerings, pieces of biscuit, a carved cross, even strands of hair tucked under coils of rope or nailed to the mast with rusted pins. Officers did their best to quash the talk. The rumors, they said, were as dangerous as storms, but even they were not immune. More than one captain reported strange disruptions in the magnetic compass, entire days unaccounted for in the logbook, stars that shifted slightly out of place, sails that tore clean in calm weather, crew falling ill with no fever, only silence. One particular story, told in hushed tones between gulps of rum, followed a ship called La Fortuna Negra, the Black Fortune. She had left Cartagena bound for Seville, heavy with silver and spices. After 2 weeks of strong sailing, she vanished. Not a plank or barrel washed ashore. Years later, a merchant vessel reported seeing her again, anchored in a small cove near Hispaniola. When approached, they found no crew, only a freshly lit fire in the galley and a single coin resting on the helm. They left quickly. Other encounters were subtler. Whispers carried over the waves, bells ringing faintly in open water. A chill that passed across the deck in tropical heat. Sailors claimed to feel watched, to hear footsteps when no one was near. More than one crewman threw himself overboard after such sightings, convinced he was being followed by something that didn't belong in daylight. The sea breeds silence, and in that silence, belief grows. Even the most skeptical among them, men who had fought pirates and braved typhoons, admitted there were things they couldn't explain. The ocean was too vast, its history too deep. It swallowed ships, men, and truth alike. Some blamed the ghosts on guilt, the weight of conquest, the blood spilled to fill the holds with gold, the thousands of enslaved lives lost in the passage. Perhaps, they said, the sea had begun to remember. Perhaps it returned some ships, not as warnings, but as judgments. Others saw it differently. They said the ghosts were just echoes, memories too strong to vanish entirely. Ships that had carved their presence into the salt and wind, returning like faded dreams, not hostile, just lost. Like the men who still watched the horizon long after their shifts ended, hoping for the familiar outline of home. But even among believers, there were rules. You never spoke the name of a ghost ship at sea. You never pointed directly at it. And if you heard your name whispered on the wind, you never answered. These weren't superstitions for fun. They were protocols, passed from generation to generation with the same seriousness as rigging instructions or storm drills. There's one last story often told, one that every Caribbean-bound sailor seemed to know. It involved a man who stood lookout every night of his voyage, searching for a ship he had once seen as a boy. He never spoke of what it looked like, only that he would know it when he saw it again. Decades passed. He sailed dozens of routes, survived storms, mutinies, and famine. And then, one night, he pointed into the mists, smiled, and stepped off the deck into the sea without a sound. No one found a body. But the next morning, the lookout's post had a mark carved into the rail, a small circle with a line through it. The crew said nothing, just painted over it quietly. The legends of ghost ships didn't thrive solely because men believed in phantoms. They endured because they were useful, quiet stories to voice anxieties that couldn't be shared openly. When they were afraid of death, when they missed home, when they questioned their choices. A ghost ship was never just a ship. It was a metaphor for something they carried quietly, deep inside guilt, loneliness, or the heavy, nagging feeling that perhaps none of this was justified. Perhaps none of it would be forgiven. The sea was an unending mystery, dark and inscrutable, and those who sailed it needed a language beyond what their captains allowed. Supposedly lost in a hurricane, its crew had been condemned never to rest because they had spilled innocent blood. As Diego told the tale, those listening around him shifted uncomfortably, remembering faces from ports they had visited, faces they pretended to forget. The story wasn't just a ghost tale. It was an unspoken confession. Diego never said more about it, and no one asked. Men spoke of ghost ships when they wanted to speak of other things. A crewman named Diego once whispered a story after his shift, telling about the ship known as La Perdition, the Perdition. A crewman named Diego once whispered a story after his shift, telling about the ship known as La Perdition, the Perdition. Supposedly lost in a hurricane, its crew had been condemned never to rest because they had spilled innocent blood. As Diego told the tale, those listening around him shifted uncomfortably, remembering faces from ports they had visited, faces they pretended to forget. The story wasn't just a ghost tale. It was an unspoken confession. Diego never said more about it, and no one asked. They knew better. Ghost ship stories were also warnings. They reminded men of the fragile line between order and chaos, of the thin boundary between the living and the dead, the sane and the mad, of the fate awaiting those who broke the unspoken rules of the sea. Desertion, mutiny, betrayal. In this way, these tales acted like a kind of moral compass, twisted and dark. They gave shape to the fear that discipline alone could not contain. They gave words to the silent weight carried by every man shackled to the ship's rhythm. Sometimes these stories were woven into actual events, blurring lines until fact and myth became indistinguishable. One officer reported hearing straying on a fog-shrouded night. When he investigated, he found no crew, no ship, only the faint scent of salt and flowers. Other times, ships returned from voyages with entire crews missing, empty cabins, and unexplained damage. The survivors spoke only in hushed tones, avoiding the subject like a plague. These whispered accounts fed the growing lore of a ghost fleet, a spectral armada said to sail the Caribbean, composed of vessels lost to storms, disease, or war, forever roaming without rest or crew. Sailors swore that if you spotted one, you should cross yourself, lower your voice, and never look directly at its lanterns. Some believed the ghost fleet was cursed punishment for sins too terrible to name. Others thought it was a gathering of souls, bound to the sea until the empire that sent them to its depths finally fell. Regardless of interpretation, the belief was real enough to affect behavior. Captains altered courses to avoid certain waters rumored to be haunted. Men hesitated before night watches near areas where ghost ships were said to appear. Even the most pragmatic officers tolerated these superstitions, knowing fear could be as powerful a motivator as any cannon. Interestingly, these stories were not unique to Spanish sailors. Pirates, traders, and fishermen from every corner of the Caribbean shared similar tales. The sea was a shared stage, and the ghost fleet was a collective myth born from shared experience. In some ports, particularly in the quieter harbors, old sailors still spoke of ghost ships with a mix of reverence and dread. They told younger men to respect the sea and the stories it carried, to remember that what was lost might never be found. The tales of the ghost fleet remind us that the sea, for all its vastness, was never empty. It was filled with memories, with grief, with secrets whispered by waves. It held the echoes of those who vanished without trace and the silent witness of ships that sailed forever, even as their crews faded into legend. As you imagine yourself standing on deck, the night cool against your skin, and the stars above steady in their watch, remember that beneath you lies a history of mystery and loss. The sea keeps its stories close. Some it shares in whispered whines, others it guards in silence. The ghost fleet, real or imagined, is part of that keeping. It is the sea's own echo of human fear, of longing, and of the unquiet past. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in the cramped, dimly lit quarters below deck. You are a cabin boy aboard a Spanish galleon, barely 12 years old. You fetch water from the pumps, careful to avoid slipping on the wet planks. You avoid the rougher hands of the boatswain, who might use you as an errand boy, or punish you for a misstep. Your eyes stay sharp for danger, loose rigging, sudden weather shifts, the unpredictable temper of the sea. You share the space with rats and insects. Sometimes, when the storm hits, water seeps through cracks, wetting your clothes and chilling your skin. But sleep is precious, and you cling to it whenever you can. Some stories are true. Others are fanciful. You listen eagerly. Imagine yourself someday a great mariner, steering ships through storms, commanding crews with a steady voice. You see men fall ill, and sometimes you help carry them to the surgeon's corner. You share a bond with other young hands, trading small kindnesses, a dry spot on a bench, a piece of cloth for a torn sleeve, a secret place to hide from the sun. These friendships are fragile but vital. They are the threads that hold you together. You learn the names of those who don't wake. You don't speak of it much. You learn that silence is safer. You carry messages between officers and crew, dodging between hammocks and barrels. Your fingers are raw from hauling ropes, your feet often sore from walking on splintered wood. A life of hardship and hope, of shadows and light, of silence and song. You learn to tie knots, to climb the rigging, to read the stars just enough to know where you are. The cook once handed you a slice of bread warm from the oven. A sailor taught you a lullaby to sing when the storms raged and sleep refused to come. At night, you sometimes catch glimpses of the officers' families on the docks before departure, and you dream of a life beyond the endless sea. You become a messenger, a helper, an apprentice in all things maritime. Each day is a lesson, and every task is a test of endurance. The air is thick with the scent of salt, sweat, and wood tar. When the sun breaks over the horizon, spilling gold onto the crests of waves, you climb to the upper deck and breathe deep. The salt air fills your lungs, and for a moment, the fear and cold and fatigue recede. But above all, you fear being forgotten. In a world ruled by men twice your size and centuries your senior, you wonder if you will ever matter. You watch the birds riding the thermals, the dolphins racing alongside the bow, the endless blue stretching to forever. Because in some quiet corner of your heart, you believe that your journey is part of something greater than yourself. Around you, men are stirring. The ship's rhythm is waking to creaks and gropes rattling, the soft murmur of voices muffled through the bulkheads. Sometimes, when luck allows, you sneak a piece of dried fruit or a handful of nuts from the galley stores. The cook doesn't look kindly on this, but sometimes he turns a blind eye to your hunger. You learn quickly where the shadows fall and how to move without being caught. Your day begins quietly, but quickly becomes a constant rhythm of movement and noise. Your duties are small, but essential. Despite your youth, you have learned to be invisible when needed. You slip past sleeping sailors without waking them. Meals are simple and often meager. You share scraps of hardtack and salted pork with the other boys. Your sleeping place is narrow, a hammock slung between two beams, cramped, but offering some sway that almost lulls you to sleep. Despite the hardships, there are moments of small joy. Your world is small, but filled with stories. Older sailors tell you tales of great battles, faraway lands, and treasures lost and found, but the reality is often harsher. You witness arguments that end in bruises. There is also a strange hierarchy among the boys and young men aboard. The cabin boy is lowest, but not without allies. Your duties expand as you grow older. Yet, even in this harsh world, you find moments of tenderness. Your fears are many. You worry about storms that might capsize the ship, about being thrown overboard for a mistake, about the unknown lands you might never see. And yet, each morning you rise before dawn and begin again. Because the sea waits for no one. Because the ship must sail. This is the life of a cabin boy, small, often unnoticed, but essential. Chapter 13. Storm over the Atlantic. A galleon's final hour. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast and unpredictable expanse, where weather shifts suddenly and storms can rise from the horizon like phantom beasts. For sailors aboard a Spanish galleon, the sea's temperament was a constant shadow. Every voyage carried the risk of drowning beneath a relentless sky, and some storms were remembered for generations, not just for their power, but for the way they tore ships apart, scattering men and memories alike. Imagine yourself on deck as the sky darkens. The wind is rising, a cold breath blowing from the north that makes the sails snap and strain. The first drops of rain fall sharp and cold. Crew members rush to their stations, voices raised in urgent commands. The captain's face is grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat, eyes scanning the roiling clouds gathering above. The ship's timbers begin to groan under the mounting pressure. The rigging rattles like chains in a dungeon. Waves rise taller and closer, white foam breaking like thunder against the bow. The air tastes of salt and lightning, heavy with the scent of impending storm. Inside the hold, the crew secures cargo, fastening ropes tightly around chests and barrels. The precious gold and silver, including the royal fifth, is locked away in iron-bound chests, the keys kept close by trusted officers. Below decks, the sailors brace themselves, clinging to anything stable as the ship pitches and rolls violently. On deck, the storm hits with full force. Rain hammers down, drenching the men in seconds. Thunder crashes overhead, shaking the very bones of the ship. Lightning splits the sky, illuminating sails torn and flapping like wounded wings. The crew shouts orders to reef the sails to reduce their surface area and prevent them from ripping away completely. The galleon fights the wind, but the waves rise higher, each one a wall of water threatening to swallow the ship whole. The mainmast creaks dangerously, cables strain, and the deck tilts at impossible angles. Men shout warnings, scramble for safety, and secure rigging with hands slick from rain and salt. The storm drags the ship into a relentless dance. Each wave threatens to flood the deck, wash over the rails, and drag men into the Black Sea below. The wind screams, tearing at clothing and hair, whipping the spray into stinging curtains. The roar of the storm is broken only by the creak of wood and the cries of men fighting for breath and balance. Below decks, the air is thick and suffocating. The ship groans as water seeps through cracks and the pounding waves jar the hull. Men huddle in cramped spaces, holding on to ropes or each other, praying for the storm to pass. Some clutch religious icons, others bite leather straps or mutter prayers under their breath. Amid the chaos, the captain moves with purpose, issuing orders and adjusting sails, his voice rising above the storm. He knows that one wrong decision could mean disaster, not just for the treasure, but for every soul aboard. His face is set, eyes sharp despite exhaustion and fear. Suddenly, a wave crashes over the deck with such force that it sweeps away barrels, ropes, and even men. Shouts turn to screams, hands grasp desperately at anything steady. The crew fights to hold the ship together, to keep it afloat. A spar breaks loose, smashing into the railing and sending splinters flying. The mainmast shudders and bends precariously. The rigging snaps with a sharp crack. The sails flap wildly, threatening to tear completely free. The galleon lurches, rolling dangerously to port. The storm rages on through the night, relentless and merciless. Lightning flashes reveal terrified faces, some stoic, some breaking with fear. The sea claims its due silently, but surely. Throughout these hours, the gold chests remain locked, the weight of empire pressing down amid the chaos. Each man knows the cost of failure, not just his own life, but the wealth that fuels a kingdom thousands of miles away. As dawn approaches, the storm shows no sign of abating. The sky remains heavy and gray, the sea swollen and angry. The ship is battered and leaking, but still afloat. The survivors cling to hope, weary and battered, watching the horizon for any sign of calm. This is the final hour of the galleon before fate decides whether she will weather the storm or succumb to the depths. The journey of the Royal Fifth did not end with collection or taxation. In fact, the most perilous chapter often began after the coins left the mines and treacherous mountain paths, long before they reached the glittering courts of Spain. These chests were heavier than they looked, each one holding fortunes that could buy armies or build cities. They were stored deep within the hold of the galleons, sometimes guarded by armed soldiers, always watched by officers. Yet no amount of vigilance could fully protect such wealth from the capricious sea or the greed of men. Transporting this treasure across the vast oceans was a feat fraught with risk, suspense, and human sacrifice. Yet capture or sinking meant death or imprisonment and loss of the crown's gold. They altered manifests, hid portions of the treasure, or arranged secret deals with smugglers waiting at distant ports. Entire fortunes vanished under their watch, never reaching the royal coffers. The promise of a share of the treasure, however small, inspired loyalty and bravery. For many sailors, the Royal Fifth was a looming shadow over their lives, a tax on their labor and risk, but also the thread that tied them to something larger. Sometimes ships were burned to prevent seizure, their cargo lost to flames rather than enemy hands. Royal officials scrutinized every chest, verifying weights and seals. You see not just treasure, but a complex web of history where gold was both prize and price. The money was melted down or minted anew, its origins folded into the official story of empire. It would be spent on armies, palaces, and colonization, on ambitions that reached far beyond the ships that had brought it. The silver and gold were packed carefully into wooden chests, sturdy, iron-bound boxes with thick locks and seals stamped with royal insignia. Storms were the most feared hazard. The Caribbean and Atlantic were infamous for their sudden squalls and hurricanes. These betrayals sowed mistrust among fleets, complicating what was already a dangerous voyage. Many returned home poorer than when they left, broken by toil and loss. Some never returned at all. And the Netherlands, eager to intercept and seize the riches meant for Spain. To defend against these threats, Galleons often sailed in convoys, guarded by armed warships. Still, despite precautions, ambushes and skirmishes were frequent. It represented the crown's power and reach, but also the perilous human cost woven into the empire's fabric. Every coin told a story of danger and determination, of faith and fear, of dreams chased across oceans and mountains. A sudden change in wind direction could lash the sea into towering waves, tossing ships like toys. Masts could snap like twigs. Decks flooded. The Atacha alone carried an estimated 40 tons of silver and gold, much of it royal fifth. Its wreck lay undisturbed beneath the Florida Keys for centuries, a silent graveyard of riches and lives. The story of its sinking was whispered among sailors for generations, a cautionary tale of nature as unforgiving power and the fleeting nature of wealth. Crew clung desperately to rigging and ropes. In the chaos, treasure chests sometimes broke loose, tumbling through the hold and smashing against beams. Men were lost to the water, dragged down by heavy coin-filled chests, or drowning under the weight of armor. One storm in 1622 claimed the Nuestra Senora de Atacha and several other ships in the so-called Spanish Plate Fleet. Pirates and privateers were another constant threat. The Spanish treasure fleets were prime targets for England, France. The human cost of these encounters was steep. Crews fought bravely, often outnumbered, defending their ships and treasure. But threats weren't always external. Corruption and betrayal could be just as deadly. Some captains and officers saw opportunity in secrecy. Stories abound of captains who died mysteriously before delivering their cargo, of chests disappearing overnight, or crews mutinying over withheld shares. Despite the risks, the allure of immense wealth kept men returning to the sea. Upon arrival in Spain, the treasure faced yet another gauntlet. Yet for those who risked everything to extract and transport this wealth, the rewards were uneven. The royal fifth was thus both a symbol and a burden. As you imagine the weight of these chests, the sound of waves against hulls, and the lives intertwined with this journey. Chapter 14. The Forgotten Bones of the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast is a place of quiet secrets. Its warm waters and shifting sands have long hidden the remains of ships, sailors, and stories lost to time. Beneath the waves lie the silent remnants of the Spanish Empire's ambitions. A graveyard of timber, metal, and human lives waiting patiently to be remembered. Imagine standing on a windswept dune, the salt air heavy with the scent of seaweed and damp earth. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the shoreline. Around you, the grass sways softly, hiding fragments of a past that you have seen but many have felt. Beneath your feet, buried just beneath the sand, lie bones weathered by time, but still present. The remains of men and women who once sailed these waters, caught in storms, shipwrecks, or battles that left no survivors. Their names are lost, their stories unrecorded, yet their presence lingers etched into the landscape like whispers carried by the wind. Over centuries, waves have shifted the coastline, revealing and concealing these silent witnesses. Pieces of wood splintered by salt and storm, rusted nails twisted by the pressure of sand, fragments of pottery, glass beads, and coins, glinting faintly when the sun catches them, just so. These artifacts tell a story of danger, endurance, and loss. One of the most famous wrecks along the Gulf Coast is that of the San Esteban, a treasure-laden galleon that vanished mysteriously in the early 17th century. Historians piece together accounts from survivors, nearby fishermen, and scattered debris to reconstruct its final hours. The San Esteban carried gold, silver, and spices destined for Spain. Instead, it found its resting place beneath the shifting sands, its riches scattered across the ocean floor. Local legends speak of the San Esteban's ghostly crew, seen walking the shoreline during foggy mornings, their figures blending with mist and memory. Fishermen tell tales of nets snagging on unseen wreckage, and divers speak of eerie lights flickering beneath the water, as if the ship's lanterns still burn. The Gulf Coast treacherous waters have claimed countless vessels beyond the San Esteban. Storms, shifting shoals, and hidden reefs make navigation perilous, even for the most experienced sailors. Each wreck is a story of ambition, misfortune, and the unforgiving sea. Archaeologists have worked painstakingly to uncover these stories, piecing together fragments from underwater sites and shoreline digs. Each discovery offers a glimpse into the lives of those who sailed these ships, their tools, weapons, and personal belongings, revealing daily routines and moments of crisis. Bones found at these sites often bear marks of injury, disease, or starvation, silent testimony to the hardships endured. The skeletal remains tell of men who fought storms, battled illness, and faced the unknown with courage and fear. They were fishermen, soldiers, merchants, sailors, and slaves. Together, they form a human tapestry woven by the sea's relentless hand. Many of these bones and artifacts have been reburied or protected to preserve their dignity, yet some remain exposed, vulnerable to wind and tide, reminders of history's fragile grasp. The Gulf Coast, with its gentle waves and quiet beaches, holds these stories close, inviting us to remember and reflect. Today, visitors to the coast may walk these shores unaware of the deep history beneath their feet. The sand, the grass, the gentle lapping of waves all seem peaceful. But beneath lies a world shaped by the collision of empire and nature, of human ambition and the sea's enduring power. As the sun sets, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold, you might pause and imagine the sailors who once stood where you stand. Feel the weight of their journey, the fear in their hearts, the dreams they carried. The bones beneath the dunes whisper their presence, a silent chorus reaching across time. And in that moment, the Gulf Coast becomes more than a place of sand and sea. It becomes a bridge, a connection between past and present, between those who came before and those who watch the horizon now. As the sun dips below the horizon and the sky softens to twilight, the Gulf Coast takes on a different kind of stillness. The gentle sound of waves brushing against the shore is a lullaby sung over centuries. It is a song for those who never made it home, for the ships lost to storm and time, and for the countless souls whose stories remain buried beneath sand and sea. These forgotten bones, scattered and hidden, remind us that history is not only written in books or carved on monuments. Some remain untouched by violence, suggesting deaths from illness or exhaustion. Together, they form a silent testament to the human cost behind the riches carried across oceans. The living stand where the dead once struggled, where empires clashed with nature, and where dreams of wealth met the reality of sacrifice. They speak of lives shaped by courage and hardship, of journeys that changed the world, and of the fragile beauty found even in the shadows of history, but also in the silent, persistent presence of those who lived it. The lives of sailors, soldiers, and slaves, often lost to the official records, linger quietly in the landscape, waiting for us to listen. Remember the forgotten bones, the shattered ships, and the countless souls who dared to cross the ocean's vastness. In the small towns along the coast, you might find local tales passed down through generations, stories of shipwreck survivors washed ashore, of treasures buried in secret coves, or of mysterious lights dancing over the water on moonless nights. These stories, part myth and part memory, weave together the human need to connect with the past, to find meaning in loss, and to honor those forgotten by time. Each discovery sheds light on the daily realities aboard the galleons, the tools used for navigation, the clothing worn by sailors, the weapons they carried, and the personal items they cherished. These finds give faces and stories to the names long erased from history. Modern fishermen haul nets over ancient wrecks. Beachcombers stumble upon shards of pottery or fragments of ships' timbers worn smooth by time. And beneath it all, the sea holds its secrets with a quiet patience. Archaeologists and historians continue to explore the Gulf Coast's watery graves, unearthing artifacts that speak of resilience and tragedy. The bones themselves tell a somber tale. They show signs of hardships, endured injuries sustained in storms, malnutrition, and the brutal conditions of forced labor. The Gulf Coast is a place where the past and present meet in subtle ways. As night falls and stars scatter across the sky, The coast feels like a threshold, a place between worlds. For those who listen closely, the whispers beneath the waves are not just echoes of loss, but reminders of endurance. So, as you rest here near the edge of land and sea, imagine the stories beneath your feet. Their legacy lives on in the sands, the tides, and in the quiet moments when history feels close enough to touch. As your eyes grow heavy and the world around you softens, take a moment to reflect on the vast journey we've shared. From the cramped decks of the Spanish galleons, through storms that tested the limits of human endurance, to the quiet shores where forgotten bones rest beneath shifting sands, we have traveled not just across oceans, but through time itself. Imagine the sailors who once stood where you lie now, their faces worn by salt and sun, their hands rough from ropes and labor. They faced dangers unseen and storms unimaginable, yet their stories live on, carried gently on the breeze and whispered by the waves. Their lives were woven into the fabric of history, a tapestry of courage, hardship, hope, and loss. Yet here in this moment you are safe. The seas have calmed. The storms have passed. The stars above shine steady and serene, guiding you not toward unknown horizons, but inward to rest, to peace, to quiet dreams. Feel the rhythm of your breath, slow and steady, matching the gentle ebb and flow of the tide. Let the weight of the past lift, replaced by the soft embrace of the present. The creak of timber and rush of waves fade into silence. The night holds you gently, like a hammock swinging softly between two strong arms. Know that history is not just the story of empires and treasures, but also the quiet resilience of those who lived it. And now, as the sea settles into stillness, so can you. May your mind drift like a ship on calm waters, unhurried and free. May your dreams carry you to distant shores, bathed in soft moonlight and gentle breezes. And when you awaken, may you do so refreshed, carrying with you the peaceful strength of the ocean's endless embrace. Thank you for joining this voyage through time. Rest now, for the journey continues in the quiet depths of sleep. Good night.